Welcome back to another story on Super Harry. This time, we're bringing you ICW Emergency Session Exposed 2100 Illegal Blood Contracts on Harry and Exiled Dumbledore Forever. Your likes fuel our creativity. Subscribe and stay tuned. Here's the story. Chapter 1. The ledger. The cart screamed down the rails at a speed that had no business existing underground, and Harry Potter held the iron bar across his lap with both hands and said nothing. Beside him, Hermione had her eyes open. She always kept her eyes open, even when the darkness came rushing at them like a wall, and in her lap sat a leather satchel that she hadn't let go of since they'd left the surface 40 minutes ago. Ragnarok sat across from them both. That alone told Harry how serious this was. The High Director of Gringotts did not ride the carts. He had not ridden a cart in 60 years, by his own account, and the look on his ancient, leathery face suggested that this occasion had not improved his feelings on the matter. His hands were folded over the head of a black iron walking staff. His eyes, amber, sharp, and deeply unimpressed with the world, were fixed on Harry with the particular intensity of someone who had been waiting a long time to have a specific conversation. The cart bottomed out through a curve and began to climb. "How much further?" Hermione asked. "We passed the third ward seal in approximately 90 seconds, Ragnarok said. His voice had the texture of gravel being pushed across slate. "After that, another 2 minutes to the archive chamber. You will feel the pressure change when we cross the seal. Do not speak while we cross it." Harry nodded. Hermione did too, though her hand moved unconsciously to the satchel strap. The third ward seal hit them like walking through cold water, a pressure that started at the crown of Harry's skull and pushed slowly down through his jaw and chest and then released all at once, leaving a faint ringing in his ears. The air on the other side of it tasted different. Older. Like the air in a room that had been closed for a century. Neither of them spoke. The cart slowed as it came into a chamber so vast that the far walls disappeared into darkness, and Harry looked up and could not find a ceiling. The rails terminated at a stone platform. Ragnarok stepped off before the cart had fully stopped, moving with a certainty that suggested the ground owed him the courtesy of being exactly where he expected it. Harry swung out after him, and Hermione followed, her boots ringing sharp on the stone. The platform was empty except for a door. Not a grand door, not iron-banded oak or glowing runic metal. Just a door, plain and dark-stained, set into a wall of blank stone. It had no handle. No lock that Harry could see. No hinges on this side. Ragnarok pressed 2 fingers flat against the wood and spoke 3 words in gobbledygook. The door swung inward. Beyond it was a room about the size of a decent sitting room, and every wall was shelves, and every shelf held ledgers. Not scrolls, not files, ledgers. Hundreds of them. Fat, dark-spined, age-cracked at the corners. They were packed in with no space between them, floor to ceiling, and the smell that came out of the room was something between old parchment and copper. "The sealed archive," Ragnarok said. He did not step inside. "Everything in this room represents a binding contract entered into Gringotts' magical record under the Blood Covenant protocols. Every ledger corresponds to a single primary party. Every entry within it is a contract that bears that party's blood, signature, or hereditary proxy." Harry stepped into the room. The door behind him didn't close, but he felt the ward seal settle around the space, a faint tightening, like the air itself paying attention. He walked to the nearest shelf and read the spine of the closest ledger. Potter, James Harold, primary. He didn't touch it. He turned instead and found the one directly below it. Same shelf, same position, just 1 row down. Potter, Harry James, primary. That one he pulled. It was heavier than it looked. The cover was dark green, almost black, and the spine crackled when he opened it. The pages were not numbered, they were dated. Every entry had a date at the top, a contract summary in the middle, and at the bottom, instead of a signature, a dark red smear that had dried brown with age. The first entry was dated July 31, 1980. The day he was born. Harry stared at it for a moment, then looked at Hermione. She had come to stand at his shoulder without him hearing her cross the room. She was reading the entry over his arm, and her expression had gone very still, the particular stillness she had when she was processing something that she didn't want to be true. "That's a marriage contract," she said quietly. "I know. You were born that day." "I know, Hermione." She reached past him and turned the page. Another entry. Another date, August 14, 1980. Another contract. She turned the page again. September 3, 1980. Again. October. November. Twice in December. Then a gap, then 5 entries clustered in February of 1981, and after that it was continuous, entry after entry after entry, sometimes 3 to a page, sometimes 4, the dates marching forward with a horrible, industrious regularity. Hermione made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "How many?" Harry asked. Not to her, to Ragnar, who was standing in the doorway with his hands on his staff and his face arranged into the careful neutrality of someone delivering news he has been legally obligated to withhold until this moment. "In your ledger alone," Ragnar said, 2,117 entries. Of those, 2,103 are classified under Blood Covenant protocols, meaning they carry magical enforcement. The remaining 14 are conditional contracts, they activate upon specific triggers. The room was very quiet. 2,000, Harry said. And 117. Hermione closed the ledger with a soft thud. "How is that possible? Blood Covenant contracts require the blood of the primary party." He was an infant. He couldn't have, they did not use his blood, Ragnar said. In the majority of cases, they used hereditary proxy. A legal mechanism under Goblin law, and, until recently, accepted by the British Ministry, that permits a magical guardian to enter binding contracts on behalf of a minor heir, provided the guardian holds formal proxy authority. Who held the proxy authority? Harry asked. For the first 42 contracts, entered between July 1980 and October 1981, your father, James Potter. The remaining 2,075 were entered under the authority of a single proxy holder. Harry already knew the answer. He felt it sitting in his chest like a stone. "Dumbledore," he said. Ragnar inclined his head. Hermione pressed her fingers to her mouth for a moment, then lowered her hand. "When did he acquire proxy authority?" "November 1, 1981. The day after the attack on your family home. He filed the proxy claim at Gringotts at 6:43 in the morning. Before the ministry had begun their own investigation. Before any next of kin had been contacted. Before," Ragnar paused, and something moved in his amber eyes, not quite emotion, but something adjacent to it. "Before you had been collected from the ruins of the house." The silence stretched for long enough that Harry could hear the distant, faint screaming of cart rails somewhere deep below them. "He filed it before he placed me with the Dursleys," Harry said. "Yes. So from the moment he decided what would happen to me, from the moment he decided my whole life, he also decided that he would hold authority over everything I owned, everything I was owed, everything I could become." That is an accurate characterization. Harry set the ledger on the reading table in the center of the room. He didn't slam it. He placed it with a careful, deliberate flatness that was somehow worse. "I want to see them all," he said. Ragnar allowed a pause. Then he said, "That is why I brought you here." They spent 4 hours in the archive. Hermione worked systematically, starting from the beginning of the ledger and cataloging every entry in the notebook she'd produced from her satchel within the first 10 minutes. She wrote quickly and without looking up, and every so often she would make a short, sharp sound, not quite a word, and set her pen down for exactly 3 seconds before picking it up again. Harry recognized it as her version of screaming. He worked differently. He went straight to the contracts he could feel, the ones that had a faint pull to them, a tug at the edges of his magic like a fish hook set so deep you'd stopped feeling the individual sting and just lived with the weight of it. He found them by feel more than by reading, and what he found confirmed what Ragnar had told him and then went several steps further. There were marriage contracts, yes, 43 of them, to families ranging from minor British wizarding nobility to 2 French dynasties and 1 rather alarming Italian senatorial house. Some were conditional on his reaching 17, some on him surviving the war, some on criteria so convoluted they would have tied his entire adult life into legal proceedings just to contest them. But the marriage contracts were almost the least of it. There were financial debt contracts, Harry's vault, his parents' vault, his godfather's sealed estate, all used as collateral in deals he'd never known about, backing political loans and institutional debts for the ministry, for Hogwarts' rebuilding fund after the war, for 3 separate Wisengamot factions that had needed quiet liquidity at inconvenient moments. There were property contracts. Loyalty oaths filed in his name that bound his political standing to specific institutional blocks. There were what Hermione identified, around the 2-hour mark, as conscience contracts, rare, borderline illegal instruments that attempted to bind the primary party's magical conscience to a specific cause or ideology. Someone had filed 11 of them in Harry's name, all citing the defense of the light as the binding principle. "This is the one that bothers me most," she said, holding up one of the conscience contracts. Her voice was very level. "Do you understand what this would do if it activated fully? It would literally make it magically painful for you to act against what whoever filed this defined as the light. You would feel it as physical discomfort. Compulsion. She stopped. Started again. It's one step removed from an imperious curse. In terms of intent, it's not a different thing at all." "Did any of them activate?" Harry asked. He was sitting on the edge of the reading table, arms crossed. Hermione looked at the parchment. "I don't know. I'd need a diagnostic specialist. A magical law practitioner who knows blood covenant instruments." She set it down. "Harry, some of these would have been running this whole time. Active contracts that you've been under. Your whole life." "Yeah," he said. "You don't seem surprised." "I'm not surprised," he said. "I've been unraveling this for 2 years, Hermione. I knew something was this big. I didn't know the exact number." He looked at the ledger. 2,117. "What are you going to do?" He didn't answer immediately. He picked up the nearest conscience contract and read it again, slowly, all the way to the bottom where the proxy signature sat in Dumbledore's distinctive copperplate. The signature had a small seal pressed beside it, Hogwarts' crest, used in Dumbledore's capacity as headmaster, lending institutional weight to a private transaction. He put it back down. "First," he said, "I'm going to understand exactly what we have. All of it. Every contract, categorized, cross-referenced, with the legal weight of each one documented." He looked at Hermione. "That's why you're here." She straightened slightly, notebook in hand. "I'm already doing it." "I know." He almost smiled. "Second, I need to understand who benefits from these contracts currently. Not who filed them, who's holding the active end of each one right now. Because Dumbledore filed most of them as proxy, but a proxy doesn't hold a contract for themselves. They file it on behalf of someone else's agenda." Hermione went still. "You think these contracts were favors?" "I think some of them were. I think some of them were insurance, people who helped Dumbledore over the years, who got a piece of me as payment. A political alliance that needed cementing. A family that needed to believe their daughter would marry well. A faction that needed to know the chosen one's political loyalty was guaranteed." He slid off the table. 2,075 contracts in 20 years. That's not one man's agenda. That's an economy. Ragnar, who had been standing in the doorway with the patience of a mountain for the entire 4 hours, made a sound that might have been, in a goblin, the equivalent of deep satisfaction. "That," he said, "is what Gringotts has believed for 11 years. We have been unable to act because the contracts are filed under British wizarding law and protected by ministry statute. We have no jurisdiction to void them unilaterally. He paused. We have, however, kept meticulous records of every party currently holding an active end of each contract. In anticipation of a day when someone with the authority to act would choose to do so. Harry looked at him. You've been waiting for me, he said. We have been waiting for the primary party to reach legal majority, fully independent status, and sufficient political understanding to exercise that authority effectively. Ragnar's amber eyes didn't blink. That took longer than we anticipated. I was a bit busy. You defeated a Dark Lord at 17. Yes. We are aware. We were, nevertheless, waiting. Something shifted in Harry's chest, not quite gratitude, not quite humor. More like the feeling of a piece clicking into place. What do you want from this, Ragnar? Gringotts doesn't do anything without wanting something. We want the contracts voided under international magical law, Ragnar said immediately. Not British law, international. Because 17 of these contracts cross national boundaries and involve foreign magical bloodlines. Which means they fall partially under ICW jurisdiction. Which means the ICW can be petitioned, Hermione said, looking up sharply. An emergency session. If the primary party petitions for review and the contracts cross international lines, the ICW has mandatory jurisdiction. The British ministry cannot block it, Ragnar confirmed. They can object. They can argue. They cannot stop it. The session must occur. Harry was quiet for a moment. And when it does, he said, and the full scope of this comes out, 2,000 contracts, filed by proxy, by one of the most powerful and trusted figures in the British wizarding world, what happens to him? Nobody spoke. What happens to Dumbledore? Harry said again. Ragnar set his staff against the floor with a small, precise sound. That depends entirely on what the ICW decides. It has never been tested at this scale. There is no precedent for 2,000 blood covenants being voided simultaneously. He let that sit. There is precedent, however, for the exile of a magical practitioner found to have violated international blood sovereignty on a mass scale. Hermione's pen had stopped moving. Exile, she said. The word came out very careful, like she was testing its weight. It is a formal ICW sanction, Ragnar said. Rarely used. It strips the individual of recognized standing in all ICW member nations. They may live. They may practice magic in private. They may not hold office, conduct formal magical business, teach or enter into any recognized institution. He paused. For a man of Dumbledore's temperament, it would arguably be worse than Azkaban. Harry picked up his ledger. He tucked it under his arm. Ragnar, he said. I want copies of everything in this archive. Full copies, bound and authenticated under Goblin seal, admissible in any international magical court. We anticipated this request, Ragnar said, and produced from the folds of his robe a small iron key. The copies are already prepared. They have been prepared for 11 years. He held out the key. They are waiting in a secondary vault, accessible only to you. Harry took the key. It was cold and heavier than iron ought to be, and when it sat in his palm he felt his magic stir against it, something recognizing something. His blood recognizing a seal that bore his blood. He closed his fingers around it. Then let's go, he said. We have work to do. They came up out of the earth into late afternoon London, the September light slanting orange across the cobblestones of Diagon Alley. The crowds were thinning toward evening, witches and wizards collecting children from the Quidditch supply shop, a group of Hogwarts-age students clustered outside Florian Fortescue's, a ministry owl banking hard overhead with a fat scroll under one wing. Normal. Busy. Perfectly ordinary magical London. Hermione waited until they'd put a full block between themselves and the Gringotts entrance before she said, Harry. Yeah. Are we actually doing this? He glanced at her sideways. Hermione Granger, 23 years old, with her hair pulled back and her notebook clutched to her chest and the look on her face that she got when she was scared and determined in exactly equal measure. He'd known that look since they were 11. "We are absolutely doing this," he said. "It's going to break things," she said. "Not just Dumbledore. The whole system. The Wisengamot, the Ministry's relationship with Gringotts, half the political alliances that have held since the end of the war, Hermione." He stopped walking. She stopped too, and turned to face him on the uneven cobblestones with the evening light in her eyes. "Do you want to know the thing that bothers me most? Not the marriage contracts. Not the financial ones. Not even the conscience covenants, which are genuinely the most revolting thing I've read since Umbridge's educational decrees." "What?" she said. "The first one," he said. "July 31st, 1980. Filed by my father, before Dumbledore ever had proxy authority. I'm not angry about my father, I think he was probably pressured into it, and I'll never know the whole story, and that's a grief for another time." He paused. "But the date. He filed it the day I was born. Before I'd taken a breath outside my mother's body, someone had already decided that who I was going to be was a resource. Not a person. A resource. And every single contract after that built on that first one, built on the assumption that Harry Potter, the person, the actual individual, was secondary to Harry Potter the symbol, the asset, the political chip." Hermione looked at him. "And the thing is," he said, "it worked. For 20 years, it worked. I was the thing they needed me to be. The boy who lived. The chosen one. The weapon. I didn't even know there was a version of me that could be anything else, because every time I started to become my own person, there was another crisis, another Dark Lord, another reason to keep being the thing that was useful." He held up the iron key. "This is the first time I've held actual evidence that it was engineered. Not just circumstance. Not just the terrible luck of being in the wrong crib on the wrong night. Engineered." She was very quiet. "So yes," he said. "We're doing this. And I'm not sorry about what it breaks." She looked at him for another moment, then she reached out and put her hand briefly on his arm, not a hug, not a dramatic gesture, just a hand on an arm. The kind of touch that meant "I'm with you." "All right," she said. "Then we need to go over the ICW petition process tonight. I have the current charter in my flat, I've been keeping up with the international amendments because of the liaison work. I know what the emergency session threshold is. I know which delegates we need on side before we file." She was already thinking out loud, already 3 steps ahead, already becoming the person she was when she had a real problem to solve. "We need to contact Ragnarok about the 17 international contracts specifically, those are our wedge into ICW jurisdiction, and we need to frame them correctly so the petition can't be dismissed on a technicality. I also need to talk to Neville," Harry said. Hermione stopped. "Neville? Why?" Then she made a sharp sound. "The Longbottom family. There are contracts involving the Longbottom estate, aren't there?" "3 of them," Harry said. "I saw the cross-references in the archive. Filed against his family's standing, used as political leverage in the same network. Neville's going to want to know." "He's going to be furious," Hermione said. "Yes," Harry agreed. "That's rather the point." She turned and they started walking again, both of them with their minds already running forward through the work ahead. The cobblestones gave way to pavement and the pavement gave way to a side street, and overhead the last of the orange light was fading out of the London sky. "Harry," Hermione said, more quietly. "Yeah. How long have you known it was this big? Not 2,000 contracts specifically, but how long have you known it went this deep?" He was quiet for a moment. A cab went past on the Muggle street ahead, headlights blinking on in the early dusk. "Since the Battle of Hogwarts," he said. "Not the details, I couldn't have told you about blood covenants or proxy authority or any of it. But I walked into the forest that night knowing he'd planned for me to die. I walked into it anyway. And after, when everything was done, I kept thinking, he planned all of it. Every step of it. He planned the Horcruxes, he planned the prophecy, he planned the whole arc of my life from the night my parents died to the night I went to meet Voldemort. Everything was arranged. He paused. And I thought, a man who arranges that much doesn't stop arranging. He just arranges different things. Hermione didn't say anything for half a block. He did save us, she said finally. The Order. The Resistance. Without him, I know, Harry said. He genuinely believed it was all necessary. I know that too, Harry said. That's not the point. The point is that genuine belief doesn't give you the right to file 2,000 contracts in a child's name and spend 20 years building a person as an instrument of your strategy. He didn't sound angry. He sounded very clear. He can believe every single thing he did was right and still be held accountable for it. Those two things can both be true. They reached the junction where their paths separated. Hermione's flat was north, Harry's was east, and the quiet familiarity of having done this 1,000 times settled between them. I'll have the petition framework ready by tomorrow morning, she said. I'll be at yours at 8, he said. She turned to go, then stopped. Harry. One more thing. He waited. When this comes out, she said, and she chose her words carefully, the way she always did when she was saying something she'd been thinking about for a long time. When the session happens and everything comes out, people are going to have to choose sides. Not just politically. Personally. People who loved him. People who still believe he was right. It's going to hurt them. Yes, he said. And you're prepared for that? He looked at her steadily. I don't need it not to hurt them, he said. I need it to be true. She held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once, the decisive, committed nod that meant she'd resolved something internally. Then she turned and walked north, her notebook under her arm and her mind already working. Harry turned east. The key was still in his hand. He could feel his own blood in it, the faint pulse of magic recognizing magic, and he turned it over once between his fingers and then tucked it into his jacket pocket. 2,117 contracts. 42 filed by a father who had loved him. 2,075 filed by a man who had shaped him. He walked east through the London evening with the ledger under his arm and the city moving around him, indifferent and bright and full of people who had no idea that in a sealed archive beneath their feet, the architecture of an entire system of power had just been seen by someone who intended to do something about it. The wind off the river was cold and tasted like rain. Harry put his head down and walked faster. He was almost back to his flat when his pocket vibrated, not a phone, not an owl, but the small round communication mirror Ragnarok had given him 2 months ago when he'd first started the archive investigation. It was a goblin instrument, untappable by ministry channels. He stopped under a streetlight and held it up. Ragnarok's face looked back at him from the glass. I should have told you this in the archive, the goblin said. I chose not to, because I wanted you to see the ledger before you heard this. I did not want your reading of it to be colored by additional information. What is it? Harry said. Dumbledore is not in exile yet, Ragnarok said. He retired from Hogwarts following the war and has been residing in Geneva under a low profile, but he has not been formally sanctioned by anyone. He continues to receive visitors. He continues to correspond with members of the Wisengamot and the ICW. A pause. Including, in the last month, 3 ICW delegates from Eastern European blocs who are expected to sit on the emergency session. Harry felt the implication settle. He knows, Harry said. Or suspects. He has known about the archive for 3 years, Ragnarok said. We know this because he attempted to purchase access to it through an intermediary in the summer of 2020. The intermediary was politely declined. Something in Ragnarok's voice could have been called dry satisfaction. But a declined request is still a request. He knows the archive exists and knows what it contains. He has had 3 years to prepare. Harry looked up at the streetlight. A moth was hitting itself against the glass in small, determined arcs. Then we move faster than he expects, Harry said. That would be advisable, Ragnar said. I need the copies from the secondary vault by tomorrow evening. They will be waiting. And Ragnar, Harry lowered the mirror slightly, catching the goblin's eyes. Thank you. For keeping this. For 11 years. For waiting. Ragnar looked at him for a moment with those amber, ancient eyes. Gringotts does not forget contracts, Mr. Potter, he said. And Gringotts does not forgive violations of blood sovereignty. He paused. But in this particular case, I will confess that there is also a matter of justice that exceeds institutional interest. Another pause, longer than the first. Your mother was a remarkable witch. She came to Gringotts herself, in the summer of 1981, to dispute a contract that had been filed against her estate without her knowledge. She was very young. She was very clear. He held Harry's gaze. She did not succeed. We were constrained by the law as it stood. She was refused. The amber eyes didn't waver. I have thought about that meeting for 40 years. Harry's grip on the mirror tightened, just slightly. Then let's make sure it counted for something, he said. Ragnar inclined his head. The mirror went dark. Harry stood under the streetlight for a moment in the London night, the moth still going at the glass above him, the city still moving, the key still cold in his pocket, and then he straightened and walked the last 2 blocks home, already composing the letter he would send Neville before he slept. There was work to do. There was so much work to do. And for the first time in a very long time, Harry Potter was not afraid of any of it. Chapter 2, the 47. The letter reached Neville at 6:30 in the morning, which meant it had been written sometime around midnight, which meant Harry hadn't slept. Neville knew this because he knew Harry, and because the handwriting on the envelope, neat enough, but pressed harder than usual into the parchment, had the particular quality of someone who had been sitting very still with a lot of energy and nowhere to put it. He read the letter at his kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold beside him and his greenhouse boots still unlaced on his feet. He'd been about to go out to the plants. He did not go out to the plants. He read the letter twice. Then he sat back in his chair, looked at the ceiling of his cottage kitchen, low beams, herb bundles drying, the comfortable smell of soil and something green and alive, and said, very quietly, one word that would have startled anyone who knew him from school. Then he picked up his wand and sent a reply. I'll be in London by noon. Don't start without me. Hermione's flat was the kind of organized that looked like chaos to people who didn't understand her system, which was most people. Books covered every horizontal surface, but they were categorized. Harry had learned this years ago and now navigated the stacks with the ease of someone who had been briefed. The ICW charter amendments were on the left side of the dining table. British ministry statutes were stacked against the bookshelf by the window. International blood law, a relatively obscure field that Hermione had apparently been researching for longer than she'd admitted, took up the entire kitchen counter and was held down by a teapot, 2 empty mugs, and a jar of pens. When Harry arrived at 8, she already had 3 pages of petition framework written out and a list of 17 contract cross-references pinned to the wall with a sticking charm. Neville's coming at noon, he said, setting the copies from Ragnar's secondary vault on the table. They came in a locked iron box, sealed with a goblin mark that looked like it would take an argument with the box itself to open. The box opened for Harry immediately when he touched it, releasing a faint smell of copper and old magic. Inside were 412 pages of authenticated contract copies, each one bearing a goblin seal in the bottom right corner. Hermione looked at the box. Then at Harry. Did you sleep? Some, he said. She let that pass. Neville. How did he take it? He replied in under a minute, so draw your own conclusions. She handed him a mug of tea, already made, already the right strength, and turned back to her framework. I've been going through the international jurisdiction question. The 17 cross-border contracts are the key, like Ragnarok said, but the grounds are stronger than I first thought. 3 of them involve French bloodlines, which means they fall under the Accord de Sang. French magical blood law has its own ICW recognition treaty. 2 involve Italian senatorial families who are technically registered as ICW protected houses. She pointed to a line on her parchment. An ICW protected house means the ICW has a standing duty of oversight for any blood covenant involving them. That duty was never fulfilled. That alone is a mandatory review trigger. How long does a mandatory review take to get to an emergency session? Under the 1932 revised charter, 12 days minimum. But there's an expedited clause for cases involving over 50 active blood covenants. She looked at him. We have 2,100. Under the expedited clause, the session can be called in 72 hours. Harry set his mug down. 72 hours. We file the petition this morning, assuming everything is in order. The ICW Secretariat is legally required to schedule the session within 3 days. She paused. That's the window where Dumbledore can try to block it. He can't stop it under international law, but he can file objections, seek to have the jurisdiction questioned, try to get the expedited clause challenged. He won't be able to, Harry said. Not with the goblin seals on the copies. Those are internationally recognized under the Vault Sovereignty Accords. I know. But he'll try something. She said it without drama, just as a fact to be accounted for. He's had 3 years to prepare. We have 3 days. He has more institutional relationships than almost anyone alive. She paused. I think we need someone inside the ICW. Someone who can make sure the petition lands on the right desks and doesn't get buried in administrative procedure. Harry nodded slowly. I know someone. She raised an eyebrow. Amelia Bones, he said. She retired from the ministry after the war, moved to Brussels. She's been sitting as an independent arbitrator on ICW cases for 4 years. She's got no loyalty to the British ministry apparatus anymore, and she suspected, I think, that something wasn't right about my situation even back when she was running the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Hermione looked thoughtful. She'd be the right person. If she agrees to present the petition internally, it can't be quietly redirected. She has too much standing. A pause. Will she agree? She will when she sees what's in the box, Harry said. Neville arrived at 12 with a bag over his shoulder and mud on his boots, and he looked less like the man who'd pulled a sword from the sorting hat and more like someone who had spent the last 3 hours doing something with his hands that he did not want to stop doing, because if he stopped, he would have to sit with the thing Harry's letter had told him, and he wasn't ready to sit with it yet. He dropped the bag by the door, took in the maps and parchments and the open iron box on the table, and pulled out a chair and sat down. Show me, he said. Hermione slid the relevant copies across the table, the 3 Longbottom cross-references, extracted and placed on top. Neville read them. His face did a number of things that Harry watched from across the table, and none of them were crying and none of them were dramatic. What they were was a very controlled, very quiet settling, the kind of expression that happened when something you'd suspected but not been able to name finally had a name. Grand new, Neville said, when he'd finished reading. Harry frowned. You think so? I know so. He set the papers down. She never said it outright, but when I was 16, after the ministry battle, she sat me down and told me, very carefully, very specifically, that I should never sign anything relating to the family estate without consulting Gringotts first. Not the ministry. Not the Wisengamot. Gringotts. He tapped the papers. At the time I thought it was just her being paranoid. She was always paranoid. But she was saying, don't trust the system. She knew the system had already been used against us. The Longbottom contracts were filed as political leverage, Hermione said. The cross-references show they were used to compel your family's public political support for 3 specific Wisengamot votes between 1985 and 1992. Neville looked at her. Which votes? She read from the parchment. The renewal of the Emergency Magical Powers Act in '85, that's the one that gave the ministry extended surveillance authority after the First War. The Hogwarts Governance Amendment in '88, which expanded the headmaster's autonomous authority over student welfare. And she paused. The Werewolf Registration Amendment in 1992. The room was briefly very quiet. The Longbottoms were known for voting against that last one, Harry said. Your Gran was on record opposing mandatory registration. And she voted for it, Neville said flatly. In the end, she voted for it. I found her records. I never understood why. He was quiet for a moment. Because they had a contract on our estate. She had to. He sat back. His hands on the table were very still. Remus Lupin was registered under that amendment. He spent the rest of his life on a list he'd never wanted to be on. He looked at Harry. A man we knew. A man who was good. And my family was used to put him there, without our actual consent, because someone needed the votes and had the right leverage. Harry said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. Neville picked up the copies again and straightened them into a neat stack. The movement was deliberate, like someone choosing what to do with their hands. I want to testify, he said. At the session. I want to speak. I was going to ask you, Harry said. I know. I'm not waiting to be asked. He set the stack down. What else do you need from me right now? Sit in on the meeting this afternoon, Harry said. I'm going to contact Amelia Bones in an hour. I want you there when I do. Neville nodded. Then he looked at Hermione. What are the odds the petition gets through without interference? Hermione considered this the way she considered everything, thoroughly and without false comfort. If Harry reaches Bones before Dumbledore's network gets wind of what we're doing, the odds are very good. The legal grounds are solid. The international angle makes it essentially untouchable under British law. She paused. The question is speed. Once we file, there's no taking it back and there's no keeping it quiet. The moment it hits the ICW Secretariat, it becomes a matter of record. People will know. Good, Neville said. He reached for the teapot and poured himself a cup, as though the conversation had been settled to his satisfaction and it was simply time to move on to the next thing. Let's be quick about it then. The fire call to Brussels went through on the second attempt. Amelia Bones appeared in Hermione's fireplace in a blaze of green flame, seated in an office chair with a pen in her hand and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and she looked exactly as Harry remembered her, square-jawed, sharp-eyed, the kind of person who could convey patient attention and pointed skepticism simultaneously with a single expression. She looked at Harry first, then at Hermione and Neville behind him. Potter, she said. Her voice was exactly as he remembered it too. I had a feeling I'd be hearing from you eventually. I assumed it would be sooner. I needed to gather evidence first, he said. And have you gathered it? 2,117 Blood Covenant contracts authenticated under Goblin Seal, covering my name and 3 connected estates. He paused. Including contracts with international parties that trigger mandatory ICW review under the 1932 Charter. Bones was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then she pulled the reading glasses off her forehead and set them on the desk beside her with a small, precise click. Tell me everything, she said. He did. He gave her the condensed version, not every detail, but the architecture of it. The proxy authority filed the morning after his parents died. The categories of contracts. The cross-border elements. Ragnarok's 11 years of waiting. The expedited clause. He spoke clearly and without editorializing, laying it out the way he imagined she preferred information, structured, evidence first, conclusions at the end. When he finished, she was still. The copies are authenticated under Goblin Seal, she said. Yes. All 400 pages. 412. And the original ledger is still in the Gringotts archive? Intact and unaltered? Ragnarok guarantees it personally. Bones looked at the space just beyond the fire for a moment. Her expression had the quality of someone running rapid calculations behind a very composed face. Who else knows about this currently? The four of us, Harry said. And Ragnarok. And Dumbledore suspects the archive exists. He'll move quickly once you file, she said. He has friends in the ICW Secretariat. 2 delegates from the Eastern European blocs who have historically aligned with British positions. Ragnarok mentioned them. Then Ragnarok told you the truth about how prepared Dumbledore is. She looked directly at Harry. He's not going to make this easy. He's going to argue jurisdiction. He's going to argue that proxy authority is a legal right and that the contracts, however numerous, were individually valid under British wizarding law at the time of filing. He is going to make the case that everything he did was within the scope of his authority as your magical guardian. Can he make that case successfully? Under British law? Possibly. Under international blood law? She shook her head. No. The sheer scale defeats the argument. You cannot claim individual validity when the total number suggests systematic exploitation of proxy authority. No British court has ever ruled on 2,000 blood covenants from a single proxy holder. Because it has never happened. Because it should not have been possible for it to happen. Her jaw tightened slightly. The system failed. Multiple systems failed, repeatedly, over 20 years. That's what the session will have to reckon with, not just one man, but the institutions that allowed one man that much unchecked authority. She picked up her pen. Send me the petition framework, she said. I'll review it tonight. If the grounds are as solid as you've described, I'll walk it into the ICW Secretariat myself first thing tomorrow morning. I have standing as an independent arbitrator to present emergency petitions on behalf of international parties. You'd be putting yourself in a difficult position, Harry said. I've been in difficult positions, Bones said, with a brevity that closed the subject entirely. Potter. One question. Yeah. Is this about justice, she said, or is this about Dumbledore? Harry looked at her through the green-tinted fire. It's about 2,000 contracts, he said. Dumbledore is a consequence of that, not the other way around. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, crisply. All right. Send the framework. The fire went out. Narcissa Malfoy sent her owl at 3:30, and it was the kind of owl that announced itself, white, imperious, carrying the letter not in a simple leg band but in a small silk pouch, because Narcissa did nothing by half measures. Harry read the letter standing in Hermione's kitchen, and his expression didn't change very much, but Neville, watching from across the room, saw his stillness shift into a different quality of stillness, the kind that meant he was recalibrating. What does it say? Hermione asked. He handed it to her. She read it, and her eyebrows went up incrementally with each line. Mr. Potter, you have been busy. I commend the thoroughness. You will find, when you review the cross-references in your archive copies, that there are 47 contracts in which my family appears as a secondary holding party. I have known about these contracts for 6 years. I have not spoken publicly because there was no venue in which speaking publicly would have produced a useful result. There is about to be such a venue. I have documentation pertaining to the origin, authorization, and current active status of all 47 contracts. I also have correspondence, relevant correspondence, between the proxy holder and 3 ministry officials regarding the use of your estate as political collateral between 1987 and 1994. I am prepared to make all of this available to you. My terms are modest and entirely reasonable. I expect you will agree. I will be at the Leaky Cauldron at 5 o'clock. The private room at the back. Yours, N.M. Hermione lowered the letter. She and Harry looked at each other. She's had this for 6 years, Hermione said. And she waited until now, Neville said from across the room. She waited until there was leverage in handing it over, Harry said. Not with contempt, with understanding. She's not doing this for me. She's doing this because she's calculated that aligning with this process benefits her family more than staying quiet does. He folded the letter. She's probably right. Do you trust her? Neville asked. I trust that she's smart enough not to bring false documentation to something this big, Harry said. And I trust that she has a family she's spent the last 5 years trying to protect, and that she's been watching Lucius's political network crumble since the war, and that she's pragmatic enough to know that the old alliances are dead and she needs a new position. He put the letter in his jacket pocket. She's not an ally. She's a useful party with a compatible agenda. That's sufficient. What are her terms going to be? Hermione asked. I'll find out at 5. I'm coming with you, Neville said. Harry glanced at him. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, Neville said, and the tone he said it in was the exact tone Harry remembered from the courtyard at Hogwarts, the standing in front of Voldemort tone, the pulling a sword from a hat tone. Quiet and final and not interested in being argued with. I want to. The Leaky Cauldron at 5 o'clock on a Tuesday was half populated, a few after-work regulars, a table of Aurors off duty, the particular cozy haze of a pub settling into its evening rhythm. Tom the barman nodded at Harry and Neville without comment and gestured toward the back, which meant Narcissa had arrived first and established herself, which was exactly what Harry would have expected. The private room had a door that wasn't visible from the main bar. Narcissa was sitting at the small round table with a glass of white wine that she hadn't touched and a leather folder on the table in front of her. She was wearing dark grey robes, understated but impeccably cut, and she looked like someone who had been beautiful for a long time and had decided that this was simply a fact about her rather than something requiring effort. She looked at Harry when he came in and then at Neville behind him, and if Neville's presence surprised her, she did not allow it to register. Mr. Potter, she said. Mr. Longbottom. Sit down, please. They sat. You've seen the contracts, Harry said. Not a question. I've seen mine, she said. Which is to say, the 47 that list Malfoy family standing as a secondary holding party. Meaning my family was used as a guarantor for contracts filed in your name without your knowledge. She opened the leather folder with the efficiency of someone who had been rehearsing this conversation. In 6 of those contracts, the Malfoy name was pledged as collateral without the knowledge of my husband. Lucius knew about 9 of them. The remaining 32 were transacted by the proxy holder, Dumbledore, using an authority claim over the Malfoy family's wartime loyalty record. She looked up. During the First War, my family made certain arrangements with Dumbledore. Mutual non-aggression of a kind. He retained documentation of those arrangements and used them, after the war, as leverage to compel our participation in this contract network. He blackmailed you, Neville said. Narcissa's eyes moved to him. I prefer to say he exercised retained leverage, she said, with the delicate precision of someone who had spent years managing the gap between what was true and what was useful to say aloud. But yes. The practical effect was coercive. And the correspondence? Harry asked. She removed 3 folded parchments from the folder and slid them across the table. Harry unfolded the first one. It was a letter from Dumbledore to then-Minister Millicent Bagnold, dated 1987, and it was perfectly pleasant in tone, collegial, warm, the easy correspondence of 2 powerful people with a long working relationship. But the substance of it was a negotiation, the ministry's backing for specific Hogwarts expansion proposals in exchange for the guarantee of particular political outcomes, the guarantee underwritten by the various contractual instruments I hold in trust for the Potter estate. Dumbledore's own phrasing. The contractual instruments I hold in trust. Not in trust for Harry Potter. Just in trust. As though the estate, as though Harry, were a treasury to be drawn on. Harry set it down and read the second letter. Third. His face was very level throughout. The correspondence establishes that Dumbledore used your contracts as political currency with at least 3 ministers, Harry said. 4. Narcissa said. I have a fourth letter, but it involves a living individual who hasn't yet been publicly implicated. I'm prepared to include it in the documentation, but the individual's name stays under seal until the session. Agreed, Harry said. Who else knows you have this? No one. Not Draco. Her expression moved slightly, something between protectiveness and rueful acknowledgement. Draco knows I have been managing certain documentation for several years. He does not know the specifics. A pause. He would have acted rashly with this information. I needed to wait for the correct moment. And this is it, Harry said. You are filing an ICW petition, she said, with the tone of someone stating something obvious, with authenticated Gringotts documents, international jurisdiction triggers, and Amelia Bones as your presenting arbitrator. Yes. This is the correct moment. Harry studied her for a moment. She met his gaze without performance, just a direct, intelligent look from a woman who had survived a great deal by understanding power better than anyone around her. What are your terms? He said. She folded her hands on the table. 3 things. First, the 47 Malfoy contracts are voided in the same session order as the other 2,000. No separate proceedings, no separate scrutiny on the Malfoy name. We go through the process once, cleanly, and it is finished. Done, Harry said. Second. The correspondence about the ministry officials, when it becomes part of the record, the framing acknowledges that the Malfoy family provided this documentation voluntarily, as cooperating parties with the ICW review. Not as defendants. Not as implicated parties. We are witnesses. Harry considered that. It wasn't unreasonable. The Malfoys had been coerced. That was what the documentation showed. Done, he said. Third. Narcissa paused for the first time. It was a very small pause, barely a second, but it was the first moment in the conversation where she seemed to be choosing her words with real care rather than from a prepared script. The third thing isn't for me, she said. It's for Draco. Harry waited. He's been trying to rebuild, she said. Quietly. He's been working with a potions research collective in Edinburgh for 3 years, legitimate work, good work. But the Malfoy name still carries enough weight in the wrong direction that every time he makes progress, there are people who use his father's record to close doors. She looked at Harry steadily. I'm not asking for a public rehabilitation. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking that when your name is used in whatever way it will inevitably be used in the coming weeks, and it will be, because it always is, you don't use it to keep those doors closed. The room was quiet. Neville was looking at the table. Harry looked at Narcissa for a long moment. I can't control what people do with my name, he said. No, she said. But you can control what you say when you're asked. And you will be asked. He held her gaze. She wasn't asking for much, not an endorsement, not a favor, just the absence of a specific cruelty. He thought about Draco Malfoy in Edinburgh, apparently making potions, apparently trying to be something other than what his father had been, and found that he had no desire to be the thing that stood between a person and that effort. If Draco Malfoy is doing good work, Harry said, I have nothing to say against him. Something in Narcissa's posture released, very slightly, almost invisibly. Thank you, she said, and it was not the formal acknowledgement of a transaction. It was simply thank you, said plainly, by a mother. She closed the leather folder and pushed it across to Harry. Everything is in there. Authenticated copies, original parchment sealed in conservation charms, and a signed witness declaration from me that can be entered into the ICW record. Harry picked up the folder. Can I ask you something? He said. You may ask. Did you know, when you were participating in this network, did you understand the scale of what Dumbledore had done? Not just your 47. The whole of it. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the door, the pub hummed and murmured, a glass clinked, someone laughed at something. I knew it was larger than my portion of it, she said carefully. I knew the contract network existed and that my family was a small part of a much bigger architecture. I did not know the number. She paused. If I had known the number, I think even I would have been frightened by it. But you didn't say anything, Neville said. His voice was even, not accusatory, just noting a fact. No, she said, meeting his eyes without flinching. I did not. I was managing my family's survival. That is not an excuse. It is an explanation. She looked at him. I imagine your grandmother made some similar calculations. Neville was quiet for a moment. Then, to Harry's mild surprise, he nodded. She did, he said. I've been thinking about that since this morning. Narcissa stood, smoothing her robes. I would suggest that you file your petition by tomorrow morning, she said. Not because I know anything specific, but because a man who has been waiting 3 years and has relationships across the ICW is a man who has contingencies. The faster you move, the less time he has to use them. She picked up her untouched wine glass and placed it to the side with a kind of finality. Good evening, Mr. Potter. Mr. Longbottom. She left without theatre, just a straight walk to the door and out into the pub. Neville looked at Harry. She's terrifying, he said. Yes, Harry agreed. But so are the 47 contracts. He opened the folder and looked at the top letter, Dumbledore's hand, fluid and elegant across the old parchment. The contractual instruments I hold in trust. Useful, though. What's our next move? Harry closed the folder. I get this to Hermione tonight. She integrates Narcissa's documentation into the petition framework. Tomorrow morning, Bones walks it into the ICW Secretariat. He looked at Neville. And then we wait 72 hours. Neville leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. And Dumbledore's in Geneva. For now. Will he come? To the session, if he's summoned? Harry thought about that. He thought about Albus Dumbledore in a quiet house in Geneva, with his books and his correspondence and his long, careful thoughts, and what it must feel like to be that man, to have done what he'd done and believed every step of it was right and be waiting, somewhere in the back of his extraordinary mind, for the moment when it all came to its reckoning. He'll come, Harry said. He'll come because not coming would be an admission that he knows he was wrong. And I don't think he believes he was wrong. He stood, picking up the folder. That's the thing about him. That's always been the thing. He'll walk into that room and look at 2,000 contracts and still believe he had good reason for each one. And what do we do with that? Neville said. We let the room decide, Harry said. That's the whole point. We take it out of his hands and mine and we let an international body of law decide. That's all this is. Not revenge. Not punishment. He moved toward the door. Just a reckoning that's had 20 years to wait. They walked back through the pub together, out into the cooling evening air of Diagon Alley, and Harry sent Hermione a Patronus, the stag, bright and unhurried in the dusk, with a message to expect him inside the hour. The folder was under his arm. The iron key was in his pocket. The petition was 12 hours from being filed. And somewhere in Geneva, Albus Dumbledore was writing letters to ICW delegates, because a man who had planned everything for 20 years did not stop planning, not until the moment the room was actually called to order and the evidence was laid on the table and there was simply nothing left to plan around. That moment was coming in 72 hours. Harry walked faster. Chapter 3, The Summons. The ICW Secretariat building in Brussels occupied a corner of the Magish Quartier that Muggle maps simply omitted, not with any dramatic concealment charm, just the mild institutional magic of a place that had existed for long enough in its own world that the other world had simply grown around it. It was 4 stories of pale stone with narrow arched windows and a front door that was never locked because the wards around it made locks redundant. The lobby inside smelled of beeswax and old paper and the faint metallic edge of 100 different magical signatures from 100 different nations, layered over centuries like geological strata. Amelia Bones walked through the front door at 7:43 in the morning with a leather briefcase in one hand and the expression of someone who had spent 40 years in institutional buildings and was entirely without illusions about them. The duty clerk at the front desk was a young Belgian who looked up from her morning tea with the reflexive half-attention of someone who had spent 3 months watching grey-robed officials pass through her lobby without incident. She looked at Amelia. Then at the briefcase. Then back at Amelia. Amelia set the briefcase on the counter. Bones, Amelia. Independent arbitrator, grade 7. I'm filing an emergency petition under Article 34 of the revised 1932 Charter. International Blood Covenant Review, expedited clause, primary party signature attached, 17 cross-border contracts with ICW protected house involvement. She unclipped the briefcase and removed the petition folder, 412 pages of authenticated contracts, Narcissa's correspondence documentation, and Hermione's 12-page legal framework, all bound together with a strip of goblin seal ribbon that glowed faintly amber when the lobby light hit it. I'll need a receiving stamp, a session scheduling confirmation, and a formal acknowledgement to be sent to the primary party's address within 24 hours. The clerk stared at the folder for a moment. That's quite a large petition, she said. It's quite a large case, Amelia said pleasantly. 40 minutes later, she was back outside in the pale Brussels morning with a receipt in her briefcase and a session date confirmed for 71 hours hence, Friday, at 10 o'clock, in Chamber 1, the largest session room in the building. The clerk had needed to call her supervisor. The supervisor had needed to call the deputy secretary. The deputy secretary had looked at the goblin seal, looked at the expedited clause, looked at the number of contracts, and had said, with the tone of a man watching a long-fused firework finally approach its destination, Chamber 1, then. Amelia sent her Patronus, a large, deliberate hawk, to Harry's address with the single word, done. She was halfway down the street before the building behind her began to hum with the particular institutional energy of a place that had just been handed something it couldn't give back. Harry received the message over breakfast and sat with it for a moment, then put his mug down, stood up, and went to get dressed properly. Not the jeans and jacket of the last 3 days. Something better. He didn't examine why, it felt like the kind of morning that required the courtesy of looking like you'd taken it seriously. His flat was in East London, on a street that was half Muggle and half not, in a building that appeared to have 4 floors from the outside and 6 from the inside. He'd chosen it because nobody important knew his address, and he'd chosen that as a criterion without fully thinking about how much it said about his life. The flat itself was spare, books, a few photographs, a kitchen that showed signs of genuine use because he'd taught himself to cook properly 2 years ago and found that he liked it. The walls had one thing on them, a large Ordnance Survey map of Britain with small pins in it, marking locations that meant something to his ongoing investigation. Not threatening, not obsessive, just the geography of a complicated story he'd been tracing. He pulled on dark trousers and a dark jacket and checked his wand was in the inner pocket, not the holster, just the pocket, casual and ready, and looked at himself in the bathroom mirror for approximately 1 second before going to get his owl to write back to Amelia. The owl was named Minerva, which was not an homage to McGonagall but which McGonagall had nonetheless appreciated when she'd found out. She was a medium-sized barn owl with an expression of permanent mild irritation and the reliability of a Swiss watch. He was writing the reply to Amelia when his wards on the front door signaled a visitor. He finished the letter, tied it to Minerva's leg, opened the kitchen window, and then went to the door. Kingsley Shacklebolt was standing in the hallway. He was in civilian clothes, no minister's robes, no official anything, and he looked like a man who had come somewhere he hadn't told anyone about. He was carrying no bag, no briefcase. He had the look of someone who had been awake for a while and was carrying it with the practice of a person accustomed to long nights. "Kingsley," Harry said. "Harry." A pause. "Can I come in?" Harry stepped back from the door. Kingsley came in and stood in the middle of the sitting room, looking at the map on the wall with the pins in it, and Harry watched him take it in and make the quiet calculation of a man who had run intelligence operations and knew what a map with pins meant. "You're not surprised," Harry said. That you've been investigating? Kingsley turned from the map. No. I'm not surprised. He looked at Harry directly, the straight, clear look that Harry had always found the most useful thing about him. No performance. No positioning. Just the actual thought behind the actual eyes. I knew something was happening when Ragnarok requested that sealed meeting with you 6 weeks ago. Gringotts doesn't request sealed meetings with 23-year-olds unless the 23-year-old has something worth meeting about. You had me watched. I had the Gringotts entrance monitored, Kingsley said. Standard ministry security protocol, we maintain observation on unusual vault activity for any significant magical estate. He paused. I didn't report what I saw to anyone. Harry absorbed that. Why not? Kingsley walked to the window and looked out at the street, the ordinary morning street, a bus going past, a dog being walked, the perfectly indifferent world. Because I've been waiting for something like this too, he said quietly. Not in the way you have. I didn't know the specifics. But I've been minister for 5 years, and in 5 years I've been managing a system that, the longer I'm in it, the more I see the places where it doesn't hold together. The places where something was done that can't be explained by any policy I've been given. Budget lines that don't add up. Political votes that shouldn't have gone the way they did. Families that should have opposed certain measures but didn't. He turned from the window. Little fault lines. Running everywhere. They're fault lines because the whole foundation was built wrong, Harry said. Kingsley was quiet for a moment. How bad is it? 2,117 blood covenant contracts in my name. Filed by proxy. 2,075 of them by Dumbledore, from November 1981 onwards. He watched Kingsley's face. He used my estate as political collateral for 20 years. He compelled political outcomes, votes, alliances, ministry policy, by holding contracts against families who couldn't refuse him. He filed conscience covenants in my name that would have made it physically coercive for me to act against his definition of the light. The silence in the room was very complete. Kingsley sat down in the chair near the bookshelf. He sat carefully, the way you sit when your legs have made a decision before your mind quite has. The conscience covenants, he said. 11 of them. Did they? He stopped. Started again. Were they active? I've had a specialist look at 3 of them. 2 were dormant, never triggered. 1 was partially active. Harry said it evenly, without drama. From approximately 2001 to 2004, I had a partial conscience covenant running. During that time, I applied to leave Britain twice and withdrew both applications within a week. He paused. I told myself at the time that I wasn't ready. That there was still work to do here. That leaving would feel like running away. Kingsley was looking at him with an expression that had gone very careful. You think the covenant was influencing that, he said. I think a conscience covenant designed to keep me loyal to, the defense of the light, could plausibly be interpreted by magical enforcement as making it uncomfortable for me to remove myself from Britain, where the light apparently needed defending. He sat on the arm of the sofa. I'm not claiming I was puppet. I'm claiming there was a magical thumb on the scale of my own choices. For 3 years. Without my knowledge. Without my consent. Kingsley was quiet for a long time. Outside, the bus had gone and the dog had gone and the street was briefly empty. The petition has been filed, Harry said. Amelia Bones filed it 40 minutes ago. The session is Friday. I know, Kingsley said. Which meant his intelligence was fast. That's why I'm here. He leaned forward, elbows on knees. Harry. I'm not here to ask you to stop. I want to be very clear about that. I'm not asking you to slow it down or reconsider or give anyone time to prepare a counternarrative. He met Harry's eyes. I'm here because when that session happens, the British ministry's position will be scrutinized. I will be asked what I knew and when I knew it and what I did about it. I need to be able to answer that honestly. What did you know? Harry asked. Not the contracts. I genuinely didn't know about those. He said it with the precision of a man being careful because being careful mattered. But I knew, I have known for 2 years, that there were irregularities in Dumbledore's guardianship record. I found a file in the Ministry archive that referenced a proxy claim. I didn't investigate it. A pause. I should have. Why didn't you? Kingsley looked at him. The question hung between them plainly, without accusation. Because he was Dumbledore, Kingsley said. And the honesty of it, the plain, uncomfortable honesty of that sentence, sat in the room and didn't apologize for itself. Because the war was over, and I was rebuilding a ministry that had been hollowed out by Voldemort, and I needed the institutional credibility of his legacy to do it. The Order. The Resistance. The symbol of what we'd stood for. He paused. I told myself the irregularity was probably administrative. I told myself it would complicate things to pull on that thread right then. I told myself I'd come back to it. Another pause. I didn't come back to it. Harry studied him. Are you going to fight this? Harry said. Officially. As minister. No, Kingsley said. The British ministry will not oppose the ICW session. I'll make that announcement through official channels today. He sat up. I'm also going to subpoena the ministry's own records of any transactions that involved your estate as political collateral. If government officials participated in those transactions, that's a domestic matter that will be handled domestically, separately from the ICW proceedings. The correspondence Narcissa gave me names at least one living official, Harry said. I assumed there would be names. He didn't ask whose. Whoever they are, they'll go through the ministry's process. Not the ICW session. The session is yours. Harry was quiet for a moment, watching Kingsley's face. He had liked Kingsley for a long time, trusted him in the way you trust someone who has stood in dangerous places with you and not run. But trust and accountability were not the same thing, and he needed to know which one Kingsley was choosing right now. You missed it, Harry said. Deliberately or not, you missed it. And people were affected by those contracts for the 2 years you were minister and didn't investigate. Yes, Kingsley said. He didn't offer mitigation. Just yes. That needs to be part of the record, Harry said. Not to destroy you. But because the record has to be complete. What the institutions knew and when, that's as important as what Dumbledore did, because what Dumbledore did was possible partly because the institutions chose not to look. Kingsley nodded slowly. I'll give a formal statement to the ICW, he said. Full disclosure of what I found and when and what I didn't do about it. He stood. I'd rather give it myself than have it come out in testimony and look like concealment. Good, Harry said. They stood facing each other in the sitting room, the map with its pins behind Harry, the window with its ordinary London street behind Kingsley, and the morning light was very clean and without much warmth in it. Harry, Kingsley said. For what it's worth. What you've done here, the 2 years of work, the approach, the way you've handled this. He searched for the words. It's not what I expected. What did you expect? I expected rage, Kingsley said simply. You had every right to it. Anyone would have. I expected it to be louder. Harry picked his mug off the side table and finished the cold tea without expression. The rage is there, he said. I just don't let it drive. He set the mug down. It was driving me for a long time. After the war, I was furious and I didn't have anywhere useful to put it, so it just sat there and made everything gray and difficult. He glanced at the map. 2 years ago I decided to make the fury do something productive instead. Build a case. Not smash a system, build a case. Because a case is something that persists. Rage just echoes. Kingsley looked at him for a moment with an expression that wasn't quite admiration and wasn't quite something else, something closer to the look of a man recognizing another person properly for the first time. Then he nodded, once, and let himself out. The owl from the ICW arrived at Dumbledore's address in Geneva at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, local time. It was a large, official bird, brown, serious, with the ICW seal on the leather tube it carried. It landed on the windowsill of a first-floor study in a narrow townhouse near the lake with an authority that suggested it had been instructed to wait for a response. Dumbledore was at his desk when it arrived. He had been at his desk since early morning, writing letters, and the desk was covered in the archaeology of a busy correspondence, multiple drafts, parchment stacked and annotated, 3 different colored inks deployed with the systematic care of a man running a complex operation without the institutional machinery he'd formerly had access to. His half-moon glasses were on. A cup of tea sat at his elbow, the 4th of the day, currently steaming. He looked at the owl for a moment. Then he looked at his letters. The ones he'd been writing to the Eastern European ICW delegates, carefully constructed, collegial in tone, laying groundwork. He had written similar letters to 2 British Wisengamot members, 2 ministry officials, and an old friend in the French Magical Senate. He had been building, carefully and methodically, the network of support that would soften whatever was coming. He had not moved fast enough. He took the tube from the owl, removed the scroll, and read it. The parchment was formal, precise, and unambiguous. His presence was formally requested at ICW Emergency Session, Chamber 1, Brussels, Friday morning, 10 o'clock. The matter to be heard was an Article 34 petition regarding the review of 2,117 blood covenant contracts entered under proxy authority between 1980 and 2001, primary party Harry James Potter, presenting arbitrator Amelia Bones. He set the scroll on his desk. He sat very still for a long moment, the kind of stillness that was not emptiness but its opposite, the stillness of a mind moving at full speed behind a motionless face. Then he picked up his quill and began to write a new letter. Harry was at Hermione's flat for the 3rd day running, and the dining table had been fully surrendered to the case, the petition copies, the categorized contract list, Narcissa's correspondence, and now a working document Hermione had been building since the night before, a timeline. Every contract, in chronological order, with the political event it corresponded to alongside it. Looking at it laid out that way was different from looking at the contracts individually. Individually, each one was a document, a legal instrument, cold and specific. Laid out in chronological order against the events they'd shaped, they became something else. They became the record of a plan. He started with the marriage contracts because those were the most immediately useful, Hermione said, running her finger along the timeline. He needed certain families brought into the Potter orbit, or believing they were. That created social leverage within the wizarding nobility. Then, from 1985 onwards, the political contracts start. That's when he shifts from social architecture to active political manipulation. The financial contracts are the backbone. They run throughout. Your vault and your parents' vault were used as collateral continuously from 1982. She paused. The conscience covenants are late additions. 1999, 2000, 2001. After the war. After you'd survived. Why after? Neville asked. He was sitting at the end of the table, going through a secondary stack of cross-references. Because before the war he needed Harry functional and willing, Hermione said. The conscience covenants would have been too risky during the war. If Harry had felt the compulsion mechanism and identified it, everything would have unraveled. But after the war, Harry was no longer a weapon to be aimed. He was a symbol. A political asset. And you don't need a weapon to make choices. You just need it to stay in the right country and stay affiliated with the right institutions. Harry was looking at the timeline. He was still managing me, he said. Even after Voldemort was dead. Even after everything. The war ended and he started a new phase of the same project. Yes, Hermione said quietly. Neville set his stack down. Can I say something? They looked at him. "I've been going back and forth on this all day," he said. "And I keep coming back to the same thing. He did save us. He saved all of us, countless times, in ways we don't even fully know. The order, the resistance, the whole structure of opposition to Voldemort, that was him. He built it. He held it together. He paused. And he also did this. And I've been trying to figure out how both things can be true about the same person, and I think the answer is that they can be true, and it doesn't cancel either one out. He saved us and he controlled us, and both things count." The flat was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," Harry said. "I just needed to say it," Neville said. "Before Friday. Because on Friday I'm going to get up and speak, and I need to not be confused about it when I do." "You're not confused," Harry said. "You just understand that it's complicated, which is different from being confused." He looked at Neville. "The complexity doesn't change what needs to happen. It just makes it more honest." Hermione's quill had stopped moving. She was looking at the timeline with an expression that Harry recognized, the one she got when she was about to say something she'd been holding back. "I believed in him," she said. She said it to the timeline, not to either of them. "I know that's not a revelation. Everyone believed in him. But I particularly believed in him. He was the version of wisdom that I most wanted to be. Brilliant and humble and certain and principled." She paused. "And he used that. Not just with me. With all of us. The belief itself was a mechanism. If we trusted him completely, we didn't question. If we didn't question, the contracts kept running. Nobody spoke. I'm not angry at myself for believing in him," she said. "I was 11. I was 17. I didn't know. But I need to say, out loud, before Friday, that the belief was exploited. Because it was." She finally looked up. "And I need to be completely clear-headed about that when I'm in that room." Harry looked at her across the table, Hermione, with her timeline and her notebook and her 23-year-old face that had done so much work in so little time, and he felt, not for the first time, the specific gratitude of someone who has been accompanied through a hard thing by the right person. "You will be," he said. "You're the clearest-headed person in this." She straightened her notes. "Right," she said, in the tone that meant the emotional moment was acknowledged and now they were moving on. "We need to prepare testimony statements. The session format under Article 34 allows presenting parties to enter written statements into the record as well as spoken testimony. I think we should have both, a full written record that the delegates can read, and spoken testimony for the specific points we want to land in the room." "Neville speaks," Harry said. "His family's story needs to be in there. The werewolf registration vote. The compelled political outcomes." "And you?" Neville asked. "I'll speak last," Harry said. "After the contracts are entered, after testimony, after Dumbledore has had his say." He picked up a pen and turned to a fresh page in his own notebook. "And I'll say exactly what needs to be said. Not more." At 6 that evening Harry left Hermione's flat and walked south toward the Thames, not for any particular reason except that he needed to be outside and moving. The city was settling into its evening rhythm, offices emptying, restaurants filling, the particular democratic energy of London at the end of a working day. He walked along the embankment with his hands in his jacket pockets and the river grey and wide beside him, and he let himself think about Friday. Not the strategy of it, the strategy was done, the framework was solid, Amelia had it in hand. He thought about the room itself. Chamber 1, Brussels. He'd been in ICW chambers twice before, once as a visiting student on a school delegation, once 2 years ago when he'd attended a routine international magical law seminar that had been less routine than advertised. He knew the layout, tiered semicircular seating for the delegates, a central floor with the presenting and responding positions, a raised arbitrator bench at the far end. Formal, architectural, designed to convey institutional weight. He thought about walking into that room. He thought about Dumbledore walking into that room. He was honest enough with himself to acknowledge that there was a version of himself, younger, angrier, less disciplined, who had imagined this confrontation dozens of times, and in those imagined versions it had involved shouting, or crying, or some cathartic rupture that resolved everything in a single dramatic scene. The version that was actually going to happen was quieter and more permanent and, honestly, harder. Because Dumbledore was going to come in. He was going to sit in that room with his white beard and his half-moon glasses and his extraordinary intelligence and his entirely genuine belief that he had done right. He was not going to confess or crumble or beg forgiveness. He was going to make his case, clearly and eloquently and with all the rhetorical mastery of a man who had been persuading rooms full of powerful people for a century. And some of those delegates would be moved by it. Some of them would look at the 2,000 contracts and then look at the man and believe, sincerely believe, that the scale of what he'd accomplished could justify the scale of what he'd done. That was the actual challenge. Not the legal argument was solid. The human argument. The question the room would have to answer that no charter provision could answer for it: what do you do with a man who saved the world and used you to do it? Harry stopped at the embankment wall and looked at the Thames. He had not told Hermione or Neville what he intended to say in his closing testimony. He had a general shape of it in his head, but the specific words, those he was still finding. Not drafting, exactly. Finding. The way you find something you've always known was there, by getting quiet enough to hear it. His phone buzzed in his pocket. An actual phone. He'd got one 2 years ago and found it useful enough to keep. A text from a number he didn't recognize. Mr. Potter. This is Albus Dumbledore. I apologize for the informality of this medium. I hoped we might speak before Friday. Harry stared at the message for a long moment. Then he typed back, no. He put the phone away. The river went on being the river, indifferent and cold and wide, and the city went on being the city behind him, and Harry stood at the wall in the early dark and let the last 3 days settle into something solid beneath his feet. He'd expected the contact. Dumbledore would want the meeting, would want to look Harry in the eyes and make the case in private before he had to make it in public, because in private there was still the possibility of the relationship, of the history, of the complicated thing between a man who had shaped a child and a child who had grown into someone he hadn't fully accounted for. But Harry had not come this far to give the argument its best chance of working on him. He'd come this far because the argument needed to be heard by more than one person. By 200 ICW delegates. By the international record. By history. The text had been proof of one thing, at least: Dumbledore was rattled enough to reach. Which meant he was not as prepared as he'd planned to be. Which meant the speed of the filing had done exactly what it was supposed to do. Harry pushed off the wall and turned back north toward home. 2 days. Thursday passed in the way that days pass when there is nothing left to prepare and everything left to live through. Hermione finalized the written testimony statements and sent them to Amelia by midday. Neville went back to his cottage and his greenhouse and his unlaced boots, and Harry didn't disturb him because some people prepare by doing, and Neville was one of them. Ragnarok confirmed via the communication mirror that the original ledger had been placed in an internationally sealed transfer vault to be physically present at the session. Kingsley's official statement, formal and carefully worded, full disclosure, no excuses, reached the ICW Secretariat at 4 in the afternoon and landed with what Amelia's subsequent Patronus described as considerable impact. Harry spent Thursday evening cooking and reading and not thinking about Friday, which was its own form of thinking about Friday, and went to bed at a reasonable hour and slept better than he expected. He was up before 6. He dressed with the same deliberateness as Monday: dark suit, dark tie, the kind of clothes that said I am here to be taken seriously and I know it. He checked his wand. He checked his pockets. He looked at the map on the wall with all its pins and thought about what it would look like after Friday, whether he'd take it down or whether it would still have purpose. He thought he'd probably take it down. He locked his flat, walked to the apparition point at the end of his street, and turned on his heel. Brussels was cold on Friday morning. The sky was the particular pale white of northern European autumn, high and thin and without warmth, and the streets around the Magish Quartier were quiet at this hour. Harry came out of the apparition point in an alley 2 blocks from the Secretariat and walked the last stretch with his hands in his pockets and his breath making small clouds in the morning air. Hermione was waiting outside the building. Neville was already there too, standing beside her with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the Secretariat's pale stone facade with the expression of a man deciding something final. They looked at Harry when he came around the corner. He looked at both of them, Hermione with her briefcase and her determination and Neville with his quiet, settled fury, and felt the particular gravity of a moment that you have been moving toward for a long time and that is now simply, actually here. "Ready?" Hermione said. "Yes," Harry said. "Chamber 1 seats 240, she said, and the information was also a kind of comfort, in the way that facts were always her version of comfort. "Amelia's already inside. The delegates will have received the written testimony this morning with their session documentation. Ragnarok is attending as Gringotts' formal representative, he arrived last night." "Good," Harry said. Neville looked at him. "He'll be in there," he said. "Not a question." "He'll be in there," Harry confirmed. Neville nodded once, slowly, with the finality of someone who has already made every decision that matters and has nothing left to brace for. "Good," he said. And the way he said it, level, clear, and absolutely without fear, made Harry think again of a courtyard, a sword, a boy who stood up when standing up meant almost certain death, and who had never stopped being that person even when nobody was watching. Harry turned to the doors. "Then let's go in," he said. And they went. Chapter 4, The Session Chamber 1 was older than the building around it. That was the first thing Harry noticed, the way the room had a different quality of age to the lobby and the corridors, like it had been transplanted from somewhere else and the building had grown up around it afterward. The ceiling was vaulted stone, dark with centuries, and the tiered semicircular seating rose on 3 sides in deep mahogany, filling fast with delegates in national robes of every color and cut. The floor was pale limestone, worn smooth at the center where countless presenting parties had stood. At the far end, the arbitrator bench was raised 3 steps above the floor and built from the same dark stone as the ceiling, and Amelia Bones was already seated there with 2 associate arbitrators flanking her, reviewing documents with the focused calm of someone in their element. The room was loud in the way formal rooms get loud before something large begins, the particular hum of 200 people who know they're about to witness something that will be cited in future proceedings for decades. Harry walked in with Hermione on his left and Neville on his right and felt the sound shift slightly as they entered, a ripple of recognition moving through the tiers. He didn't look up at the delegates. He walked to the presenting position, a lectern and table on the left side of the floor, and set his materials down and looked at the room as a whole. Ragnarok was seated in the formal observer section to the right, ramrod straight in dark robes, his iron staff across his knees. He caught Harry's eye and inclined his head a fraction. The original ledger sat on a separate secured table beside the arbitrator bench, sealed under a preservation ward that made the air around it shimmer faintly. 412 pages of authenticated copies had been distributed to every delegate that morning in bound folders bearing the ICW seal. Hermione arranged their documents with swift, practiced efficiency and leaned close to Harry. "Eastern Bloc delegates are in the upper left tier. I can see Vasiliev and Popescu, those are Dumbledore's contacts. They're talking to each other." She didn't look anxious. She looked like someone who has identified a variable and is accounting for it. "Amelia knows." "She always knows," Harry said. Neville sat behind the lectern table and opened his own folder without speaking. His jaw was set. He looked like a man who had been waiting a long time to be in this exact room. The doors at the far end of the chamber opened. Albus Dumbledore walked in. He came alone. No entourage, no advisor, no support, just himself, in robes of deep blue that managed to look both humble and deliberate, his white beard neatly kept, his half-moon glasses catching the chamber light. He walked with a staff, not Ragnarok's utilitarian iron, but a long pale wood one, elegant and worn with use, and he moved through the chamber floor with the unhurried ease of a man who had been in important rooms for a long time and had never once been asked to leave one. The sound in the chamber changed again. More significantly this time. The hum became something more complex: recognition, discomfort, awe from some corners of the upper tiers, and a harder, more evaluating silence from others. Dumbledore walked to the responding position, the lectern table on the right side of the floor, directly facing Harry's, and set his staff against it and sat down. He looked across the floor at Harry. Harry looked back. The look lasted perhaps 4 seconds and contained, in those 4 seconds, something that could not be translated into any record or any testimony, the entire weight of a specific history between two specific people, compressed into a moment of mutual recognition that was neither hostile nor warm but was absolutely direct. Then Amelia's gavel came down once, clean and final, and the room settled into silence. This session of the International Confederation of Wizards is called to order under Article 34 of the revised 1932 Charter, she said. Her voice carried the chamber without effort. It was the voice of a woman who had spoken in difficult rooms for 40 years. Emergency review of blood covenant contracts, expedited clause, primary party petition. 2,117 contracts entered for review. Presenting arbitrator, Amelia Bones, independent grade 7. Presenting party, Harry James Potter, with legal counsel Hermione Jean Granger. She paused. Responding party, Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, former headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, former chief warlock of the Wizengamot, former supreme mugwump of this confederation. Another pause. The responding party attends without counsel. A murmur in the tiers. Dumbledore had chosen to represent himself. Harry had anticipated this. The choice was itself a statement, that no counsel was needed because no wrongdoing had occurred, or alternatively, that he trusted his own arguments more than anyone else's. Both were probably true. We will proceed as follows, Amelia continued. The presenting party will enter the contracts into the international record. The record will be formally acknowledged by this chamber. Following acknowledgement, we will hear testimony from presenting witnesses. The responding party will then have uninterrupted time to address the chamber. The presenting party will close. This chamber will then deliberate. She looked at both tables. We will begin. Mr. Potter, you may proceed. Harry stood. He picked up the first document, not a contract, but a single page. A summary. Hermione had written it, but Harry had rewritten it, and then Hermione had improved his rewrite, and the final version was a single page that said everything the room needed to know before the contracts themselves were entered. He read it aloud. He read it clearly and without rhetorical inflation, the way you state facts when the facts are sufficient on their own. The proxy authority claim. The date it was filed. The number of contracts that followed. The categories. The cross-border elements that triggered ICW jurisdiction. The financial use of the estate. The political leverage. The conscience covenants. The room was completely silent throughout. When he finished, he set the page down and said, "The presenting party moves to enter the authenticated contract copies into the international record. The originals, held in Gringotts sealed archive under Goblin sovereignty, are present in this chamber under preservation seal and available for delegate review upon request." Amelia looked at the chamber. Does any delegate object to entry? Vasiliev, in the upper left tier, raised his hand. On what grounds does the presenting party claim ICW jurisdiction in a matter originating under British wizarding law? Harry remained standing. 17 of the contracts involve parties registered under ICW protected house status or French Accord de Sang recognition. Under Article 14 of the ICW Blood Sovereignty Charter, any blood covenant involving an ICW protected house is subject to mandatory ICW oversight regardless of national origin. He paused. That oversight was never conducted. The petition triggers the retroactive review obligation. Vasiliev looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who has used a procedural challenge many times and knows when it hasn't worked. He lowered his hand. Any further objections? Amelia said. Silence. The contracts are entered, she said, and picked up her stamp and pressed it to the acknowledgement form, and the sound of it, the clean bureaucratic thump of an official stamp, was somehow the most definitive sound Harry had heard in 3 days. Done. In the record. Permanent. Undo it now if you can. He sat back down and Hermione briefly put her hand on his arm, the same gesture as the street in Diagon Alley, 3 days ago. Still meaning the same thing. The first testimony was Hermione's. She stood at the lectern with her written statement in front of her and she gave it in the measured, precise way she gave everything, but underneath the precision there was something that the room could feel, the kind of controlled feeling that makes a statement more powerful than any performance would. She walked the chamber through the legal framework. The proxy authority mechanism under British wizarding law, its intended purpose, protecting orphaned heirs from estate mismanagement, and the specific conditions under which it was meant to be used. She showed, clearly and without embellishment, how those conditions had been exceeded in every single category of contract filed. Not by error. Not by administrative oversight. By systematic, deliberate expansion of proxy authority far beyond its legal scope. The proxy authority provision, she said, near the end, was designed to protect a minor heir. It was used, in this case, to construct an economic and political architecture that served the proxy holder's agenda for 20 years, at the expense of the heir whose name and estate and blood were the raw material of that architecture. She looked up from her statement. I want to be precise about the word I'm using, raw material. Not a protected ward. Raw material. The silence in the room was different now, heavier, with a particular quality of collective reckoning. She sat down. Neville stood up. He didn't read from his statement. He'd written one, it was on the table in front of him, but he looked up at the chamber and said, I'm going to speak, if the arbitrator allows, and then you can read the statement for the full legal detail. Amelia nodded. Neville put his hands flat on the lectern. He looked like what he was, a large, steady man in his mid-20s who had grown up with something in his family that he hadn't understood and had just finished understanding, and the understanding hadn't broken him but it had changed the shape of something fundamental. My name is Neville Longbottom, he said. My parents are Frank and Alice Longbottom. They were tortured into permanent incapacity by Death Eaters in 1981 and have lived in St. Mungo's Hospital for 22 years. I grew up with my grandmother, Augusta Longbottom, who managed the family estate and the family's political standing and who spent 22 years, to my knowledge, being one of the most principled members of the Wisengamot. He paused. In 1992, my grandmother voted for the werewolf registration amendment. I know this because I checked the record. I know she opposed that amendment privately because she told me, when I was old enough to understand, that mandatory registration was a cruelty dressed up as public safety. She told me that with real anger. He looked down at his hands for a moment. What I know now, and didn't know until 3 days ago, is that a blood covenant contract against the Longbottom estate was used to compel that vote. My grandmother didn't choose to support that amendment. She was coerced. By a contract filed in Harry Potter's name, without Harry's knowledge, by his proxy holder. He looked up. Remus Lupin was registered under that amendment, he said. Most of you know who that is. Some of you knew him personally. He spent the rest of his life on a registry he didn't want to be on, with all the social and professional restrictions that carried. He died at the Battle of Hogwarts in 1998. A pause. One vote. One contract. One man on a list who shouldn't have been on it. That's what 2,000 contracts looks like at the individual level. It's not a political abstraction. It's Remus Lupin. It's my grandmother. It's families who believed they were making choices that they were actually having made for them. The chamber was absolutely still. I'm not standing here to destroy the legacy of a great wizard, Neville said. I'm standing here because great wizards are not exempt from accountability. And because accountability only works if it's applied when it's hard, not just when it's easy. He looked directly at Dumbledore's table, without hostility but without softness. You shaped all of us. You shaped the whole world we grew up in. I believe you thought you were doing right. I also believe that believing you're doing right doesn't give you the right to make everyone else's choices for them. He sat down. For a moment the chamber did not resume its sound. Then it did, a collective exhale, the sound of 200 people simultaneously deciding how to exist in a room that had just said an honest thing. 3 more witnesses testified. A representative of the French Accord de Sang, who gave a precise accounting of the 2 affected French bloodlines and the international obligations that had been violated. A specialist in blood covenant law, a small, tidy witch from the ICW's own legal department who had spent the morning reviewing the contracts and who gave testimony in the flat, definitive tone of an expert witness. The conscience covenants were not only illegal under international magical law but had not been legal under British wizarding law at the time of filing either, the relevant legislation having been repealed in 1978. They had been filed in knowing violation of domestic law. They had been active. They had influenced behavior. She said all of this the way someone recites the measurements of a structure, precisely, without heat, which made it more damning than any amount of heat would have. The 4th witness was Narcissa Malfoy. She entered the chamber with the composure of someone who had prepared extensively for this and considered composure to be both her professional standard and her personal preference. She sat at the witness position, a single chair on the presenting side of the floor, and gave her testimony with the contained precision of someone who had been managing difficult truths for a very long time and had gotten very good at it. She described the coercion. The wartime documentation that had been leveraged. The 32 contracts filed against the Malfoy family name without knowledge or consent. She produced the correspondence, Dumbledore's letters to 3 ministers, and they were entered into the record. When she got to the letter referencing the contractual instruments I hold in trust, Amelia had her read the relevant section aloud for the chamber. Narcissa read it clearly, in the voice of someone who has no personal investment in the phrasing but understands exactly what it means. I am confident that, with the instruments I hold in trust, sufficient political alignment can be ensured for the forthcoming vote. The Potter estate provides adequate guarantee of the outcome we require. I would suggest the minister proceed as planned. She lowered the letter. In the upper left tier, Vasiliev was very still. Thank you, Amelia said. You may step down. It was Dumbledore's turn. He stood slowly, with the measured care of a very old man who chooses not to appear very old, and picked up his staff and walked to the center of the floor. Not the responding lectern. The center. The place where the limestone was worn smoothest. He turned to face the chamber, and he looked at the delegates with the expression of a man who has been in important rooms for a long time and is not diminished by them, and he began to speak. His voice was what it had always been, warm, measured, carrying a quality of absolute attention that made every person in the room feel individually addressed. I am grateful to this chamber for its time, he said. I will not waste it. He didn't consult notes. He stood in the worn center of the floor, hands on his staff, and looked at 200 delegates and began to make his case. Everything in those documents is accurate, he said first, and the straightforwardness of it made the room shift. He had not come to dispute the facts. The contracts exist. I filed them. I used the proxy authority. I used the Potter estate as political leverage on multiple occasions. All of this is true, and I will not insult this chamber by pretending otherwise. A murmur in the tiers. What I will say is this, he continued. In October of 1981, Lord Voldemort was believed destroyed but not confirmed. The Death Eater network was intact and operational. The British wizarding world was in a state of traumatized fragility that made it, in my judgment, extraordinarily vulnerable to reorganization under a revived dark ideology. He paused. Into that situation, a child had survived who was, by prophecy, by circumstance, and by the particular quality of the magic that had protected him, the single most significant symbol available to a world that desperately needed something to rally around. He turned slightly, addressing a different section of the chamber. The symbol required management. Not the child. I want to be absolutely clear that I never thought of Harry Potter as anything other than a person. But the symbol, the narrative, the political and social architecture around what he represented, that required active stewardship. Because if that architecture was left unmanaged, the forces that had served Voldemort, the old families, the blood supremacists, the institutional remnants of dark alignment, would have moved to claim it. They would have used the Potter name and estate and legacy for their own ends. He looked around the room. I used it for different ends. I used it to hold together an alliance that kept the light viable for 20 years, through the return of Voldemort, through a second war, and ultimately through his defeat. He let that sit. Were my methods legal in every instance? He said. No. I have already acknowledged that. Were they proportionate to the threat? I believe they were. Would the outcome have been the same without them? He paused. I don't know. I can tell you what I saw. I can tell you the threats I was managing that this chamber was not privy to. I can tell you the names of the families who would have moved against the Potter legacy within 5 years of 1981 if I had not built the contractual structure that prevented it. His voice was steady. I did what I did in full knowledge of the cost. I did it believing the alternative was worse. I did it because someone had to and I was the only one in a position to do it effectively. He looked across the floor at Harry's table. Harry was looking back at him. I am not asking for forgiveness, Dumbledore said. I am not asking this chamber to dismiss the petition. I am asking that the full context be entered into the deliberation. That what was prevented, not just what was done, be weighed. He looked at the delegates. That is all I ask. He walked back to his table and sat down. The chamber exhaled again. It was a different kind of exhale this time, the sound of people who have heard an argument they hadn't fully expected and are now sitting with it. Because he hadn't been wrong about everything. That was the difficult part. The threat in 1981 had been real. The families who would have moved against the Potter legacy had existed. Some of them were in this room's historical record. The dark alignment in the British wizarding world had been real, and it had needed managing, and Dumbledore had managed it. And yet. Amelia turned to Harry's table. Mr. Potter. You may close. Harry stood. He didn't go to the lectern. He walked to the center of the floor, the same worn limestone where Dumbledore had stood, and turned to face the chamber. He was quiet for a moment. Not composing himself, he was already composed. Just letting the room be the room for a second before he changed it. Everything he said is true, Harry said. He said it in Dumbledore's own rhythm, clean and direct and without drama. The threats were real. The families were real. The 20-year strategy was real and it worked, in the sense that Voldemort is dead and the world he wanted doesn't exist. He looked at the delegates. I know all of that. I've known it for a long time. None of that is why I'm here. He turned slightly. I'm here because of a date. July 31st, 1980. The day I was born. Before I'd taken a breath, someone filed a contract in my name. He paused. Not Dumbledore, my father. I mention this not to implicate my father, who I believe acted under pressure and whom I have no anger toward. I mention it because it establishes the pattern. From the first day of my life, I was a resource. An instrument. A name attached to an estate attached to a strategic value. Before I was a person, I was an asset. He looked around the room. Professor Dumbledore made an argument about context, he said. About threats and prevention and the weighing of costs. It's a good argument. He makes it well. He's been making it for a long time, to a lot of people, and it has worked, because the argument isn't entirely wrong. He paused. But there is something the argument doesn't account for. It doesn't account for me. Not Harry Potter the symbol. Not the boy who lived or the chosen one or the walking political instrument. Me. The actual person. He looked at Dumbledore's table, not with anger, with clarity. I walked into a forest at 17 to die because I'd been shaped, from the day I was born, into someone who would do that. Every choice I made, every loyalty I held, every moment I stood up when I should have run, all of it was cultivated. Carefully, systematically, over 17 years, by a man who needed me to be a specific thing and built the architecture to ensure I would be. He let that breathe. And he was right that it worked, Harry said. I did what needed to be done. Voldemort died. The world survived. If you're doing the calculation of outcomes, the ledger balances. He looked at the chamber. But I am not a ledger. And no one gets to decide that the cost of a human being's autonomy is acceptable, not for any outcome. Not for the best outcome imaginable. Not even for the death of the darkest wizard in a century. He paused. Because the moment you accept that a person can be built into an instrument for someone else's agenda, however noble that agenda, you have established a principle. And that principle does not stop applying when the agenda stops being noble. The room was very quiet. There are 2,000 contracts in that record, he said. Some of them compelled votes. Some of them compelled alliances. Some of them compelled my own behavior, through illegal magic, without my knowledge. Every single one of them was filed under the premise that my existence was a resource to be managed rather than a life to be lived. He turned to face the arbitrator bench directly. I'm not here to destroy Dumbledore's legacy. I'm here because the record has to be complete. Because the next person who holds this kind of power needs to know, not abstractly, but legally, in the international record, that this is where the line is. That the line exists. That crossing it has consequences. He looked at Amelia. I trust the chamber to deliberate, he said. That's all. He walked back to his table and sat down. The silence in Chamber 1 lasted for a full 5 seconds, which in a room with 200 people in it is an extremely long time, and then Amelia brought her gavel down and called the chamber to deliberation recess, and the room broke open into noise. Hermione was looking at the table in front of her with her lips pressed together in the way that meant she was not going to cry in this room and had made that decision firmly. Neville was looking at the limestone floor. Harry sat back in his chair and looked at the vaulted ceiling, old and dark above them, and listened to the chamber fill back up with human sound. Voices. Arguments beginning. The ICW working itself toward a decision that would take the rest of the day. He was not afraid of what it would find. He had said what needed to be said, in the place it needed to be said, with the evidence that made it true. Whatever happened next, the chamber had heard it. The record had it. That was enough for today. Chapter 5, The Greater Good. The recess lasted 3 hours. Harry spent most of it outside. Not in the building's waiting area, not in the long corridor with its rows of formal benches where other presenting parties and witnesses sat with their folders and their anxiety, but outside, in the small courtyard at the back of the Secretariat building where there were 2 stone benches and a tree that had no business being as large as it was in a courtyard that size. He sat on one of the benches and ate a sandwich that Hermione had produced from her bag with the matter-of-fact care of someone who had been managing other people's blood sugar during crises since they were 12, and he watched the tree move in the autumn wind and thought about nothing in particular, which was not the same as thinking about nothing. Neville came out after the first hour and sat on the other bench and they didn't talk for a while, which was fine. The courtyard was good for not talking. The tree helped. After about 20 minutes of comfortable silence Neville said, "Do you think they'll actually do it? The exile?" "I think there's enough," Harry said. "That's not the same as yes." "No," Harry agreed. "It's not." He looked at the tree. The Eastern Bloc delegates are the variable. Vasiliev and Popescu, they've had 3 years of Dumbledore's correspondence. 3 years of relationship management. They're not going to be overturned by a morning session no matter how good the evidence is. Then what? Then the question is whether the rest of the chamber overrules them. It's a 2/3 majority for a formal exile sanction. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. We have the legal grounds. The question is whether legal grounds translate to political will when the person being sanctioned is Dumbledore. He paused. That's always been the question. Neville was quiet for a moment. You're closing, he said. Harry looked at him. That wasn't what I expected, Neville said. I don't know what I thought. Something more focused on the legal argument, maybe. Something closer to what Hermione gave them. He paused. But it wasn't. It was just, true. Very plainly true. He looked at Harry. How long had you been working on it? I hadn't, Harry said. Not really. I had the shape of it. The words came when I was standing there. Neville thought about that. Is that strange? That it came out that clearly? Harry shook his head. I've had 23 years of practice living the thing I was describing. It turns out that makes it fairly easy to articulate. Hermione came out at the 2-hour mark, sat beside Harry, and said without preamble, Vasiliev approached me in the corridor. Both of them looked at her. He wanted to know, she said carefully, whether the presenting party would be open to a compromise resolution. Formal censure, mandatory retirement from all public magical office, public acknowledgement in the ICW record, but not exile. Harry was quiet for a moment. What did you tell him? I told him I wasn't authorized to speak for the presenting party on resolution terms, she said. But I told him he should have raised it during the session if he wanted it on the table. Good. He said, and this is the interesting part, she smoothed her coat over her knees. He said that Dumbledore has agreed, privately, to the censure terms. That he would accept a formal censure and permanent retirement if exile was taken off the table. The courtyard was quiet except for the tree. He's negotiating, Neville said. Of course he is, Harry said. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't angry. It was simply Dumbledore doing what Dumbledore did, managing outcomes, finding the acceptable middle, working the room through intermediaries. Even now. Even here. He'd rather accept a censure on his own terms than have an exile imposed. The censure would let him keep his personal standing, Hermione said. He couldn't hold office or institutional position, but he'd still have recognized legal standing in ICW member nations. He could still correspond, still advise, still influence. She paused on the last word carefully. A censure without exile is a significant sanction in formal terms. In practical terms, for a man of his connections and intelligence, it's a manageable limitation. And exile isn't, Harry said. No, she said. Exile strips him of everything except the private practice of magic. No correspondence that carries institutional weight. No formal relationships. No advising. He becomes, legally, a private individual with no recognized standing anywhere. She looked at Harry. Which is what the evidence supports. Harry stood from the bench and put his hands in his pockets and looked at the sky above the courtyard wall, pale and high and cold. I'm not going to negotiate, he said. Not because I'm rigid about the outcome. But because the outcome isn't mine to negotiate. I petitioned the chamber. I gave them the evidence. I made the argument. The chamber decides, not me and not Dumbledore in a back corridor during recess. He turned back. If Vasiliev wants to make a censure argument in the deliberation, that's his right as a delegate. But I'm not going to preempt the chamber's decision by making a private deal. Hermione nodded as though she'd expected exactly this answer. Right, she said. Then we go back in. The chamber reconvened at 2:30. The quality of the room had changed during the recess in the way that rooms change when the people in them have been talking to each other, positions had shifted, alliances had been tested, the simple two-sided architecture of the morning's session had become something more complex and more human. Harry could feel it when he walked back to the presenting table. The deliberation had been working. Amelia called the session back to order with a single gavel strike. Before deliberation is formally opened, she said, the chair has received a request from the delegation of Eastern European Bloc, represented by Delegate Vassiliev, to enter a motion for amended resolution. The motion will be heard before formal deliberation vote. She looked at Vassiliev's tier. Delegate Vassiliev. Vassiliev stood. He was a compact man in his 50s with close-cropped silver hair and the careful presentation of someone who had learned to manage the gap between what he was prepared to say and what he actually thought. The Eastern Bloc delegation recognizes the gravity of the evidence presented this morning, he said. We do not dispute the legal findings. We propose, however, that the appropriate sanction is formal censure with permanent removal from all public office and a binding prohibition on institutional activity, rather than full exile. He looked around the chamber. We propose this not to diminish accountability, but because full exile is an exceptional measure that has been used twice in this chamber's history, both in cases of active magical violence against protected parties. The conduct described in this petition, however serious, did not involve direct magical violence against the primary party. A murmur through the tiers. Furthermore, Vassiliev said, the responding party has indicated willingness to accept the censure terms without contest, which would allow an immediate and clean resolution rather than a prolonged, Delegate Vassiliev. Amelia's voice was not raised. It didn't need to be. The question of the responding party's preferred outcome is not relevant to this chamber's deliberation. Relevance is limited to the evidence in the record. She looked at him with the steady patience of someone who has been in rooms with political actors for 40 years. Thank you for the motion. It will be considered. Please sit. Vassiliev sat. He did it with the controlled dignity of a man who had not got what he wanted and was not going to show it. Amelia surveyed the chamber. Deliberation is now formally open. We will hear delegate comments in order. Each delegation has 4 minutes. What followed was 2 hours of the ICW doing what the ICW did, which was to say, being very thorough in a very slow way that had the cumulative effect of a rising tide. Delegation after delegation spoke, and the range of positions was wide, deep outrage from the Nordic and Southern European blocs, careful proceduralism from the Asian Confederate delegates who wanted the legal precedent framed exactly right before they committed to a vote, the French delegation's quiet fury about the accord de sang violations which ran cold and precise under every word their speaker chose, and the complicated silence of the British-aligned delegates who said the least and revealed the most by doing so. Harry listened to all of it. He listened with the attention of someone who had spent 2 years teaching himself to sit with information and let it build rather than react to pieces of it in isolation. He watched the chamber work itself through the evidence, watched understanding arrive in different people at different speeds and through different doors, watched the moral weight of 2,000 contracts accumulate in the room like water finding its level. Neville was watching too, but differently. He was tracking faces, the particular skill of someone who had grown up in a political household and learned young to read the room behind the official position. He leaned to Harry during a brief procedural pause between delegations. Third tier, center, he said quietly. The delegate in green, Ayesha Whitehorse, North American Confederation. She came in neutral. She's not neutral now. Harry glanced up. Whitehorse was a tall woman in her 40s who had arrived that morning with the composed non-alignment of a senior delegate who hadn't committed before the evidence. She was sitting very still now, with her hands folded on her closed delegate folder and her jaw set in a way that suggested a decision made. And the Swiss delegate, Neville added, barely audible. He's been looking at Dumbledore's table for 20 minutes. Not at Dumbledore, at the table. Like he's doing arithmetic. Harry looked. The Swiss delegate, whom he didn't know by name, was indeed staring at the responding table with the focused blankness of someone running a long internal calculation. The motion for censure is going to fail, Harry said quietly. Neville looked at him. You think? Listen to the room, Harry said. Not the words, the space between the words. He tilted his head slightly toward the chamber. Nobody's defending the censure motion. They're acknowledging it and moving past it. When a proposal has support, people dwell on it. Nobody's dwelling. Hermione, on his left, had been writing throughout the entire deliberation, notes, reactions, cross-references, the running documentary instinct of someone who could not experience an important event without simultaneously recording it. She didn't look up. He's right, she murmured. The motion was entered because Vasilyev was asked to enter it. Nobody here is actually going to vote for it. They all know it doesn't fit the evidence. The last delegation to speak before the vote was called was the Australian representative, a woman in her late 60s who had said nothing during the 2 hours of deliberation and who rose now with the deliberate pace of someone who had been waiting to speak last on purpose. She said, in a very direct Australian English that cut through the formal language of the session like a blade through paper, I came here this morning not knowing what to expect, and I've spent 4 hours in this room watching 200 of my colleagues wrestle with a very old question. The question isn't whether Albus Dumbledore did good in the world. He did. Enormous good. The record is clear and nobody in this room disputes it. She looked around the tiers. The question is whether a man who does enormous good gets to make the rules about what he's allowed to do in service of that good. Whether the scale of his contribution purchases the right to use other people without their knowledge or consent. She paused. It doesn't. It never has. The moment we decide it does, we are no longer an institution of international law. We are a system of patronage dressed up in formal language, and the 2,000 contracts in that record are not an aberration, they're a template. She sat down. The chamber was still. Amelia let the stillness last for exactly the right amount of time. Then she said, "The chair calls the vote." It took 11 minutes. The process was formal, each delegation's lead representative casting a confirmed vote by standing, the tally maintained by the 2 associate arbitrators at the bench. The motion for censure went first and failed by the margin Harry had predicted, 41 votes in favor, 163 against, with 12 abstentions. Vasilyev voted for it. Almost nobody else did. Then Amelia said, "The motion before the chamber is a formal finding of culpability under Articles 14 and 31 of the ICW Blood Sovereignty Charter, and a formal sanction of exile with permanent removal of all recognized standing in ICW member nations. The exile sanction to be recorded in the International Magical Record as a binding instrument. Vote in favor to impose. Vote against to dismiss." The first 20 votes came quickly, small delegations, clear positions. Then the pace steadied. Each block's delegate rose, stated their name and their vote, sat down. The tally climbed. Harry watched it. He did not count. He watched faces instead. He watched the North American delegate, Whitehorse, stand and say in favor with the clarity of someone who had settled the matter to her own satisfaction long before the vote was called. He watched the Swiss delegate stand and say in favor with the arithmetic completion expression of someone who had finished their calculation. He watched the French delegation vote as a unanimous block, every one of them on their feet simultaneously, which the associate arbitrator had to clarify was a block vote rather than a plurality. He watched Vasilyev vote against. Popescu vote against. 4 other delegates vote against. 12 abstain. He watched it build. When the tally was complete, Amelia looked at her associate arbitrators, who confirmed the count on separate parchments and passed them to her. "The result," she said, and her voice in the silent chamber was very precise, "is 179 in favor, 31 against, 14 abstentions. The motion passes. A 2/3 majority is confirmed." She set the parchments down. The chamber formally finds Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore culpable under Articles 14 and 31 of the ICW Blood Sovereignty Charter. The sanction of exile is imposed, effective immediately upon formal recording of this session. The 2,117 blood covenant contracts entered under his proxy authority are hereby voided in their entirety under international law, with immediate effect. She picked up her pen. She signed the recording instrument. This session is, Madam Arbitrator. The voice was Dumbledore's. It was the first time he had spoken since his testimony, and the room went still in the precise way a room goes still when a sound arrives that it wasn't expecting. Amelia looked at him. She had the expression of someone who will allow this because decorum requires it and because she already knows what it will say and has decided it doesn't change anything. Dumbledore stood. He picked up his staff. He looked at the chamber, all of it, the full sweep of 200 delegates, the arbitrator bench, the limestone floor, the old stone ceiling, and he looked at all of it with the expression of a man taking the full measure of something he is seeing for the last time. I accept this chamber's decision, he said. I want this on the record, I accept it without contest. He paused. I also want something else on the record. He looked across the floor at Harry. Harry looked back. I am sorry, Dumbledore said. Not to the room. To Harry. Directly, unmistakably, across the worn limestone floor of Chamber 1. Not for the strategy. Not for the choices I made in service of it, I would make them again, because I believed then and believe now that they were necessary. But I am sorry for what they cost you. Specifically, personally, you, the person, not the symbol. I am sorry that you could not have been allowed to be simply a child. I am sorry that I needed you to be something larger than that, and that the needing made it so. He held Harry's gaze without looking away. I suspect that does not help very much. I offer it nonetheless. The chamber did not move. Harry was very still for a moment. He had thought about this, not this specific moment, but the possibility of something like it. The possibility of Dumbledore looking at him and saying the word sorry. He'd turned it over many times in the last 2 years, trying to understand what he would feel when it happened, and the answer he'd arrived at was that he didn't know. He still didn't know exactly. But he looked at Dumbledore, old and white-haired and genuinely meaning every word he'd just said, which was the complicated part, which had always been the complicated part, and said, I know, which was true, and which was also, in its way, both less and more than forgiveness. Dumbledore inclined his head. He sat down. Amelia waited 1 beat. Then, this session is concluded. Her gavel came down for the last time. The chamber broke into noise and movement. Delegates rose, conversations erupted, the formal stillness of the session dissolved into the human activity of 200 people reacting to what had just happened. Harry stayed at his table for a moment, surrounded by the movement and the noise, and found that the inside of his chest was, not empty, not triumphant. Something quieter than either. Like a sound that's been running for a very long time and has just stopped, and your ears are adjusting to the silence where the sound used to be. Hermione was watching him. She'd been watching him since Dumbledore's apology. Are you all right? She asked, quietly enough that only he could hear it. Yeah, he said. And then, after a moment, ask me that again in a week. I'll have a more complete answer. She almost smiled. Fair enough. Neville appeared from the movement around them. He sat down heavily in his chair and let out a long breath, looking at the ceiling. 179, he said. Yes, Harry said. I thought, he stopped. Started again. When Vasiliev made the censure motion I thought it might actually pull enough votes to change things. It didn't have the room, Harry said. No, Neville agreed. It didn't. He looked at the ceiling for another moment. Remus Lupin's name is in the international record now. What happened to his family, it's formally part of this. He paused. That matters. I don't know why it matters as much as it does, but it does. Because the record makes it real in a different way, Harry said. Something that happened in a small room between powerful people, that got covered over for years, it's in the international record now. They can't undecide it. It's just there. Neville nodded, still looking at the ceiling. Yeah, he said. Yeah, that's it. Ragnarok materialized at Harry's elbow with the unannounced efficiency of someone who considers announcement a courtesy he is not obligated to provide. Mr. Potter, he said. Harry turned. The voiding instrument will be formally executed by close of business today, Ragnarok said. Gringotts International Office will process the dissolution of all 2,117 contracts against your estate over the next 72 hours. You will receive confirmation at your address. He paused. There will be some turbulence. Parties who held active ends of certain contracts will find their positions altered. Some of them will contest the voiding. Their contests will fail, because the voiding is an ICW instrument and carries absolute authority over national objections. But there will be noise. I expected noise, Harry said. Yes. Ragnarok looked at him with the ancient, amber, measuring look. The ledger will be returned to the sealed archive after today's session, where it will remain as a permanent institutional record. He paused again, with the deliberateness of a man who chooses his pauses carefully. Your mother would have been satisfied with this outcome, I believe. Harry held the goblin's gaze for a moment. Thank you, Ragnarok, he said. Ragnarok inclined his head, a small movement, but from a goblin of his standing, significant. Then he turned and walked away through the thinning chamber with his iron staff and his dignity and his 60 years of waiting, and Harry watched him go and thought about a young woman in the summer of 1981 who had come to this same institution to dispute a contract and been refused, and about how far the reverberation of a thing could travel if you kept it alive long enough. Amelia found them in the corridor outside Chamber 1, where the three of them were standing with their coats on and their bags packed and the kind of slightly blank expressions that people have when an enormous thing has finished and the next enormous thing hasn't started yet. Good work, she said. It was not a performative compliment. It was the assessment of a professional who had seen the quality of the case and was noting it accurately. You did the essential part, Harry said. Filing it and making sure it landed. The essential part was the case itself, she said. I just walked it through the door. She looked at all three of them. You should know, the formal record is going to be public within 48 hours. Standard ICW Transparency Protocol. When it goes public, it will be significant news. The scale of it and the name involved will make it, she paused, selecting the word. Very loud. I know, Harry said. The British press will be difficult, she said. There are people who will defend him. People who will argue the greater good framing very loudly and very publicly. You should be prepared for that. Being prepared for noise is different from being worried about it, Harry said. She looked at him for a moment. Yes, she said. It is. She picked up her own briefcase. If you need anything from the arbitration side over the next week, I'm available. The case doesn't close until the exile instrument is fully executed, which takes 30 days for a sanction of this level. She glanced at Neville and Hermione. You should all rest. Whatever you feel like today is going to feel different in a week, and you'll need the clarity. She held Harry's gaze briefly. Well done, Potter. She walked away, decisive and unornamental, and Harry watched her go with the particular appreciation he felt for people who did their jobs with excellent quality and without theater. They went out into the Brussels afternoon. The Magish Quartier was quiet at this hour, the late afternoon between lunch and evening, when the streets had the low golden light of autumn and the particular stillness of a city settling itself before the next phase of its day. They walked without a specific direction, the three of them, in the way you walk when you need to move but don't yet need to be anywhere. After half a block Hermione stopped in front of a small cafe and said, I want tea and I'm going to sit down and have it, in the tone of someone making a quiet executive decision, and they all went in and sat at a corner table with their coats still on for the first few minutes because the warmth hadn't reached them yet. The cafe was small and warm and served tea in mismatched cups and had the honest unpretentiousness of a place that existed to be exactly what it was and nothing more. Harry ordered tea and ate the biscuit that came with it without thinking about it, which meant he was hungry, which meant he hadn't eaten since the sandwich in the courtyard. "All right," Hermione said, when the tea was in front of them and the first sip had been taken. "Talk." "About what specifically?" Neville said. "About whatever you're thinking," she said. "We've been in forward motion for 3 days and now we've stopped, and I think we should actually say things to each other instead of going straight to processing this individually in our separate homes." Neville looked at his tea for a moment. "I'm thinking about my Gran," he said. "I want to go see her tonight, actually. She's at the house. I want to tell her it's done." "She'll understand the significance," Harry said. "She'll understand every single bit of it," Neville said, with a small, real smile. "She'll probably act like she already knew and was waiting for us to catch up." "She probably did already know," Hermione said. Neville laughed, a short, genuine laugh, the first of the day. "Yeah. Probably." Hermione looked at Harry. "And you?" Harry wrapped his hands around his cup and looked at the table. "I'm thinking about the map on my wall," he said. "All the pins. I've been building this for 2 years and I'm trying to figure out what the wall looks like when the pins come down." "Empty," Neville said. "Yes," Harry said. "Which is either a problem or an opportunity, depending on how you look at it." "It's an opportunity," Hermione said, with the brisk confidence of someone who has never been comfortable with emptiness but has learned to recognize its value. "You've spent 23 years being a thing that other people needed. You've spent the last 2 years dismantling the structure of that. What comes next is the first time you get to actually decide." She looked at him steadily. "That's terrifying, and it's also the whole point." Harry looked at her for a moment. "When did you get wise?" "I've always been wise," she said. "You just weren't always listening." Neville snorted. Harry smiled, the full, real version, the one that didn't appear very often and meant he'd actually been surprised into it. He looked at both of them across the small cafe table with their mismatched cups and their coats half off and the Brussels afternoon going golden in the window behind them, and felt something that didn't have a perfect word but that lived somewhere between gratitude and relief and the particular warmth of having been accompanied through an impossible thing by the right people. "Thank you," he said. "Both of you. For all of it. The archive, the testimony, Neville getting up in that room and saying what needed to be said." "Don't thank me," Neville said. "That was for me as much as for you. Maybe more." He paused. "I've been carrying that Wisengamot vote for years without knowing why it bothered me so much. Knowing what it was, knowing it wasn't my family's choice, that's mine. That's not a favor to you. That's me getting something back." "I know," Harry said. "It's still worth saying." Neville picked up his cup. "Then you're welcome." He looked at the window. "What happens to Dumbledore now?" "Practically, I mean. He has to leave." "He has 30 days to transition," Hermione said. "The exile instrument takes 30 days to execute. During that period he can continue to live in Geneva. After that, he can live anywhere outside ICW jurisdiction, technically, but there's no territory outside ICW jurisdiction for a practicing wizard of his standing. In practical terms he continues his private life as a private individual with no institutional connections." She paused. "He's 150 years old, roughly. He'll continue to live. He'll just live, quietly. He'll write," Harry said. "He'll write and he'll think and he'll correspond informally with people who come to him. He'll still be who he is. None of this changes who he is." "Does that bother you?" Neville asked. Harry thought about it honestly. "No," he said. "It doesn't. He can be who he is. He just can't use who he is to move other people like pieces anymore. He can't sit in Geneva and manage outcomes at distance. He can't file instruments. He can't hold institutional leverage." He paused. "He can be brilliant and convinced and privately certain that he was right. That's between him and his conscience. What he can't do is build another 20-year architecture around someone who doesn't know it's there. He set his cup down. The point was never to change what he believes, Harry said. The point was to change what he can do. Outside, the Brussels afternoon was going from gold to copper, the long autumn light making the narrow street look almost warm. Inside the café, the three of them finished their tea in a comfortable quiet that had earned its right to exist, and the day settled around them without urgency or demand for the first time in 72 hours, and Harry let himself sit in it without reaching for the next thing. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. A message from an unknown number, different from Dumbledore's text. He read it, then turned the phone face down on the table without expression. "What is it?" Hermione said, reading his face. "Rita Skeeter," he said. "She wants an exclusive." Neville made a sound. "How did she get your number?" Hermione said. "Unclear." He picked up his tea. "I'm not going to respond." "Good," Hermione said. "Although," Harry said, "given that the record goes public in 48 hours and there's going to be noise about this regardless, we might want to think about who does speak and what they say. Not me. But someone should frame this correctly before the prophet gets to frame it incorrectly." Hermione was already thinking, which he could tell from the angle of her head. "Luna," she said. Harry blinked. "The Quibbler. The Quibbler has 5 times the readership it had 10 years ago. Luna has been running it seriously since her father retired. And she will tell the story in the most accurate, direct, and completely unintimidatable way of any journalist working right now." She paused. "Also, she genuinely liked Remus Lupin, and I think she'll understand why his story needs to be part of the public framing." Harry considered this. "Call her tonight," he said. "Already planning to," Hermione said. Neville put his coat fully on and stood, dropping coins on the table with the comfortable ease of someone who had decided the next thing to do and was ready to do it. "I'm going to see Gran," he said. "I'll be in touch tomorrow." He looked at Harry. "The wall with the pins. Take them down soon. Give yourself the empty wall." "Yeah," Harry said. "I will." Neville left, the cafe door ringing softly behind him, and Hermione gathered her coat and her bag and Harry left money on the table and they went out into the Brussels evening together, the street cool and copper-lit and beginning to fill with the ordinary evening life of the city. They walked the first block without speaking, and then Hermione said, "He apologized." "Yes," Harry said. "What did it feel like?" she asked. Not prying, genuinely asking, in the way she'd always been able to ask him things that she had figured out he'd actually answer. He thought about it for the length of another half-block. "Like it mattered," he said finally. "But not like it changed anything. Does that make sense?" "Yes," she said quietly. "It makes complete sense." A pause. "It's possible to accept an apology and still need the consequence. They're not the same transaction." "No," he agreed. "They're not." They reached the apparition point at the far end of the street, the same alley he'd arrived in this morning, and stopped. "Harry," she said. He looked at her. She opened her mouth and then seemed to adjust whatever she'd been about to say, the way you adjust when the prepared version turns out to be insufficient. "I know you said the rage was driving you for a long time after the war. And I know you redirected it." She paused. "But I also know you didn't just do this for yourself. The conscience covenants, the compelled votes, the Longbottoms, Remus, you did this because it was wrong and it needed undoing and you were the only one in a position to undo it." She looked at him directly. "You could have let it go. You chose not to. And I think that's who you actually are. Stripped of all the shaping and the cultivation and the architecture. Underneath all of it, that's just who you are." He didn't say anything for a moment. "I'm still figuring that out," he said honestly. "I know," she said. "But you've got time now. That's the point." She stepped back. "I'll call Luna. Get some sleep." I'll send a Patronus tomorrow morning when I've spoken to her. She disapparated with a quiet crack. Harry stood in the alley alone for a moment, in the Brussels evening, with the cold air and the copper light and the distant sound of the city around him. He thought about the map on his wall. All the pins. 2 years of careful, patient, forward-moving work, and every pin was now either resolved or resolving, and what was left after all of that was a wall, and the wall was blank, and the blankness was not a loss. He thought about what Hermione had said. You've got time now. He thought about July 31st, 1980. The first contract. The first day. The whole long architecture that had been built on that single foundation. And he thought about what it meant to be 23 years old and for the first time in his life, genuinely, legally, actually, in the international magical record, free of it. Not healed. Not finished. But free. He turned on his heel. He went home. Chapter 6, After the Fire. The Quibbler ran the story on Sunday. Luna had listened to Hermione on Friday night for 45 minutes without interrupting, which anyone who knew Luna understood was not passivity but the opposite. She was the kind of listener who went completely still when something important was being said, as though movement would disturb the air around the words. When Hermione finished, Luna had asked 4 questions, all of them precise and none of them the questions a conventional journalist would have asked. She hadn't asked about Dumbledore's legacy or the political fallout or what Harry intended to do next. She'd asked about the conscience covenants, specifically, what it felt like to learn that a piece of your own decision-making had been interfered with. She'd asked about Neville's grandmother and whether Augusta Longbottom had ever spoken publicly about the 1992 vote. She'd asked about Harry's mother, about the 1981 meeting at Gringotts that Ragnarok had described. And she'd asked, very quietly at the end, about Remus Lupin, and whether his son Teddy knew. That last question had stopped Hermione cold. She hadn't thought of Teddy. She'd called Harry immediately after hanging up with Luna, and Harry had sat with that for a while in the quiet of his flat, and then he'd said, "I'll go see Andromeda in the morning." Before anything goes public. He had. Andromeda Tonks lived in the same house she'd lived in for 30 years, a solid, unpretentious place in Kent with a garden that had always been slightly too large for one person and was managed with the purposeful energy of someone who needed things to tend. She answered the door in gardening clothes with soil on her hands, and she looked at Harry on her doorstep at 8 in the morning and said, without particular surprise, "Come in, then." They sat in her kitchen. Teddy was upstairs asleep. He was 5, and 5-year-olds slept late on Saturdays, and Harry had timed his arrival accordingly. Andromeda made tea and sat across the table and listened to Harry explain what had happened, what was in the record, what Ragnarok had told him about Remus and the 1992 amendment. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. The kitchen clock ticked. Outside the window, the Kent garden was grey with early morning. He knew, she said finally. Remus knew he'd been registered under compelled circumstances. He didn't know the specific mechanism, he didn't know about the contract. But he knew the vote shouldn't have gone the way it did. He said to me once, she stopped. Restarted with the careful precision of someone quoting someone they loved with accuracy. He said, there were people who should have voted against that bill who didn't, and I've never understood why, and it's better not to keep asking because the answer won't help. Harry said nothing. He spent 16 years on that registry, Andromeda said. It affected everything. Jobs, housing, travel. Every time he tried to build something normal there was a form to fill in and a box to tick and a look from someone who'd seen the box. She looked at her hands, soil dark around the knuckles. He built something normal anyway. That was Remus. He built it anyway. She looked up. What does it mean, that it's in the record now? It means the reason it happened is documented, Harry said. It doesn't undo it. But it's there, formally, permanently, that the vote was compelled by an illegal contract. That the registry amendment passed in part because of coercion. Teddy can know, when he's old enough, that his father's name shouldn't have been on that list. And why it was. Andromeda was quiet again for a moment. Teddy will want to know, she said. Not now. But when he's old enough to understand it. She straightened. Thank you for coming here before it went public. That mattered. I should have thought of it sooner, Harry said. You had rather a lot to think about, she said, in the dry, measured tone that reminded him powerfully of Narcissa, because however different the two sisters were, they'd grown up in the same house speaking the same language of understatement. Will you stay for breakfast? Teddy will be up within the hour and he'll want to see you. Harry stayed for breakfast. Teddy came downstairs with his hair the particular shade of blue it went when he was sleepy and not paying attention to it, and he climbed onto Harry's lap without ceremony and ate toast and talked very fast about a model broomstick he was building, and Harry sat in Andromeda's kitchen with the small warm weight of his godson on his lap and ate toast and talked about broomstick models, and the morning outside went from grey to the thin clear light of an October day, and the world was what it was. The Quibbler story ran the following morning. It was not sensational. Luna didn't write sensationally, she wrote with a directness so clean it was almost disarming, laying out facts in the order that illuminated them best and trusting the reader to understand what they meant without being told how to feel. The headline was plain: ICW voids 2,100 blood contracts, exiles former Supreme Mugwump Dumbledore. No exclamation point. No dramatic framing. Just what had happened, stated clearly. The article told the story in full. The contracts, categorized. The proxy authority and its abuse. The political outcomes compelled. The conscience covenants. It gave space to Neville's testimony and to the legal testimony about the Werewolf Registration Amendment. It mentioned Remus Lupin by name, and it mentioned the 1992 vote, and it stated plainly that the registry had been expanded in part through illegal contractual coercion. It did not editorialize about Dumbledore's legacy except to note that the ICW record contained his own statement accepting the sanction without contest. It included one quote from Harry, which Luna had asked for and he'd thought about for a day before providing: "The contracts are voided. The record is complete. What the Wizarding World does with that information is up to the Wizarding World." The Daily Prophet ran their version 3 hours later. Their version was louder. Their headline was Dumbledore exiled, hero or villain. And their article spent equal column inches on the evidence and on the retrospective defense. Half a dozen prominent wizards quoted on Dumbledore's legacy, his wartime contributions, the argument that the greater good justified extraordinary measures. Rita Skeeter's byline was not on it, which suggested either she'd been kept off the story specifically or she was being saved for a follow-up that was going to be worse. Harry read both articles at his kitchen table with tea and found that he felt precisely nothing about the prophet's framing, which he took as a sign of good health. His communication mirror vibrated twice before 9. The first was Ragnarok, confirming that the contract dissolution was proceeding on schedule and that the first tranche of voiding instruments, covering the marriage and financial contracts, had been executed at midnight. The second was Amelia, informing him that the ICW had received 47 formal objections to the exile sanction overnight, all from British-aligned parties, and that all 47 had been reviewed and dismissed under the session's binding authority. Neither call required anything from him. That was new. He sat with that for a moment, the absence of a next step, the absence of something urgently needing doing. He'd been in motion for so long that the stillness had a slightly unreal quality, like the silence after a long piece of music where your ears keep expecting the next phrase. He finished his tea. He got his coat. He went out. The pins came off the wall that afternoon. He'd been thinking about what Neville said: take them down soon, give yourself the empty wall, and he'd decided that Sunday afternoon was the right time. Not ceremonially. Just practically. Each pin came out, each corresponding note was folded and put in a box, the map itself was carefully removed and rolled and placed on the shelf where it would live not as an active document but as a record. It took 40 minutes and he did it methodically, working from left to right, and when the wall was bare it was just a wall again, pale plaster, slightly marked from the pins, ordinary. He stood back and looked at it. Then he went to the kitchen and made dinner, actually cooked, properly, the pasta dish he'd taught himself the previous winter, and ate it at the table reading a book that had nothing to do with blood covenant law or ICW charter amendments or anything else, and the evening was quiet and his own and felt like the beginning of something he didn't have a name for yet. His phone rang at 7:30. A proper call, not a text. He looked at the number, not a saved contact, but a London area code he didn't recognize. He answered. Harry Potter. A woman's voice, brisk and professional. This is Dr. Sarah Chen, I'm the director of the Edinburgh Potions Research Collective. I'm calling because, this is somewhat unusual, but one of our researchers asked me to call on his behalf. He said you might expect to hear from this collective eventually, and, well. He asked me to tell you that the dreamless sleep variant he's been working on had a successful third-stage trial this week. He thought you'd want to know. Harry set down his fork. Draco Malfoy, he said. A pause. Yes, she said, with the careful neutrality of a professional who had decided to deliver the message and not editorialize. He said, and I'm quoting directly, that if you could be told it worked and that nobody died in the process, that would be sufficient. Harry looked at the wall where the map had been. Tell him congratulations, he said. Tell him I'm glad it worked. Another pause, this one warmer. I will. Thank you, Mr. Potter. She hung up. Harry picked up his fork and continued eating and thought about Draco Malfoy in Edinburgh making something that helped people sleep without nightmares, and about Narcissa in a private room at the Leaky Cauldron asking for the one thing she most needed for her son, and about the specific satisfaction of a deal made honestly and honored completely. Monday brought the noise Amelia had predicted. Kingsley's formal ministry statement was released at 9, full disclosure, every detail, the admission that he had found irregularities and not investigated. It was the kind of statement that cost a minister politically, and Harry knew that Kingsley had written it with full awareness of that cost, and had written it anyway, and had sent it to the ICW before releasing it publicly so that the sequence was clear. This was accountability, not spin. The Wisingamot held an emergency session of their own by midday, called by 3 senior members who wanted to debate the domestic implications. It lasted 6 hours and produced nothing binding, but produced an enormous amount of noise that the prophet then reported as Wisingamot in Crisis, Dumbledore's shadow over British magic, which was technically accurate and dramatically framed, as the prophet generally managed. 4 of the families who held active ends of voided contracts made public statements. 2 expressed relief. 1 expressed outrage. 1 expressed nothing beyond a terse legal notice that they intended to pursue domestic remedies, which their legal team would presumably advise them was a dead end given the ICW instrument, but that they apparently needed to be seen to attempt. Harry issued no public statements. He had given the Quibbler its quote. He had provided the ICW with testimony. The record existed and was public and permanent. Everything that needed to be said had been said in the right place and in the right way. The noise that followed was not his to manage. He went for a run that morning, through the East London streets in the grey October drizzle, which he did most mornings and which had nothing to do with anything except that running was one of the things that cleared his head and reminded him that he had a body that existed in an ordinary world of pavements and traffic and pigeons, irrespective of whatever the wizarding world was doing with his name on any given day. He passed a newsagent with a prophet placard outside. The headline was now Potter Silence. What is he hiding? He ran past it without stopping. Hermione came over on Tuesday evening with 2 bottles of wine and the expression of someone who had spent 2 days fielding professional and personal fallout and needed to sit somewhere that wasn't her office. She poured wine and sat on his sofa and looked at the blank wall where the map had been. You took it down. Sunday, he said. She studied the bare plaster for a moment. How does it feel? Good, he said. Different. Good. She turned from the wall. I've had 42 owls since Sunday. Not all of them hostile, about half are from people who want to thank me, which is its own kind of complicated. Some are from magical law academics who want to write about the ICW case as a precedent. 3 are from journalists. She took a drink. One is from Victor Crumb, which has nothing to do with this and is a separate and ongoing situation that I'm not going to explain right now. Harry raised an eyebrow. Victor Crumb. I said I'm not explaining it. He didn't push. He'd file it and revisit later when she was in a mood to be teased about it. What about the hostile ones? There are people who believe very genuinely that what Dumbledore did was justified by outcomes, she said. Some of them are people I respect. Professors from Hogwarts, some Order members, people who fought alongside him and who are reading this as an attack on the thing they gave their lives to defend. She was quiet for a moment. I've been trying to figure out how to think about that. How are you thinking about it? That they're not wrong to honor what he built, she said. The resistance, the order, the whole structure of opposition that actually defeated Voldemort, that was real and it was his, and the people who served in it served something genuine. Honoring that isn't incompatible with what the ICW decided. She paused. I just think some people need more time to understand they can hold both things at once. Harry looked at his wine glass. McGonagall wrote to me, he said. Hermione went still. What did she say? She said, he picked up his phone and read from the photograph he'd taken of the letter, because he wanted to get it right. She said, I have spent 4 days examining my own conscience about what I knew, and what I might have suspected, and whether I failed in my duty to you as a student and as a person in my care. I find no satisfying answer. I find only that I am deeply sorry for what you experienced, that I am proud beyond adequate expression of what you have done, and that if you should ever wish to discuss any of this I am available. With the deepest respect, Minerva McGonagall. Hermione was quiet for a moment. She's a good person, she said. She is, Harry agreed. One of the best. He set the phone down. I wrote back and told her I didn't hold her responsible and that she should come for dinner sometime. Hermione smiled, a real one. She'll come. She'll bring shortbread and pretend she just happened to have it. Obviously, Harry said. They sat in a comfortable silence for a while, the way people sit who have been through something enormous together and don't need to keep talking about it. The wine was good. The flat was warm. Outside, London did its London thing, vast and indifferent and entirely untroubled by the internal proceedings of the wizarding world. After a while Hermione said, What are you going to do? Now that the wall's empty. He'd been thinking about this since Brussels. Not anxiously, with something closer to appetite, which was new. He'd been living so long in the defined shape of the investigation that the absence of it had felt briefly like a lack, but the absence was clarifying, like how your eyes adjust to darkness and start finding the things that were there all along. I've been talking to a magical law reform group, he said. Informally. A coalition that's been trying to get the proxy authority legislation rewritten for years. Tighten the criteria, add oversight mechanisms, require independent Gringotts review for any proxy filing. He paused. They've been stalled because nobody with sufficient public standing has been willing to champion it. The ministry keeps deprioritizing it because it's procedural and dry and doesn't look important until something like this happens. It looks important now, Hermione said. Yes, he said. It does. He looked at the wall. I'm not interested in being the boy who lived anymore. But I am interested in using the fact that people listen to me when I speak to say things that are actually useful. Specific things. This legislation, and a few others. Not a career in politics, I'd last about a month before I said something that got me fired. He paused. But targeted advocacy, where I know what I'm talking about and the issue matters and someone needs to be the voice that makes the room pay attention. Hermione was looking at him with an expression he recognized, the one that meant she was simultaneously assessing the idea and already thinking through its implementation. That's good, she said. You think? It uses what you actually have without requiring you to become something you're not, she said. You're not a politician. You're someone people listen to. Those are different things, and conflating them is how people end up miserable and ineffective. She tilted her head. The ICW case itself becomes the argument for the legislation. You don't have to explain why proxy reform matters, you just point at the last 2 weeks. Exactly, he said. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, I've been talking to the ICW about a permanent liaison position. Not British ministry, directly ICW employed, working on the international blood law framework. Using what we built in this case as a foundation for a broader review of how blood covenant instruments are regulated across member nations. Harry looked at her. Brussels, he said. Probably. Part-time. I'd keep the London work too. She met his eyes. It feels like the right thing to do with the expertise. It would be wasteful not to. It would be an enormous waste, he agreed. You should do it. She nodded. I think I will. A pause. We built something, these last 2 years. Not just the case. The way we work together, the approach, evidence first, legal framework, institutional channels. She looked at her wine glass. I want to keep building things that way. So do I, Harry said. Wednesday brought the letter he'd been expecting and not looked forward to. It arrived not by owl but by hand, delivered to his front door by a young man in ICW livery who asked for a signature and left without conversation. The envelope was sealed with the ICW mark and beneath it, in dark blue wax, Dumbledore's personal seal, the same seal Harry had seen on 2075 contract filings over 20 years. He opened it at his kitchen table with his morning tea. The letter was 2 pages in Dumbledore's handwriting, and Harry read it once, then sat with it for a moment, then read it again. It was not an apology, Dumbledore had given that in Chamber 1 and he was not the kind of man to repeat himself. It was not an argument, that was finished too, and he appeared to know it. What it was something harder to categorize. It was Dumbledore explaining himself not to defend what he'd done but because he seemed to feel that Harry deserved the full explanation. Not the public version, the real one. He wrote about 1981. About the night he'd placed Harry with the Dursleys and the calculation behind it, not just the blood protection, which was the official reason, but the strategic one. That a child raised in the wizarding world would be shaped by it from birth. Would grow up with the weight of expectation and legend and the complicated politics of the post-war years pressing on him constantly. That a child raised outside it would come to it fresh, with a kind of freedom that a child raised inside it could never have had. He wrote about the proxy authority claim. He acknowledged that filing it before Harry had been collected from the ruins was wrong, not legally wrong under the instruments he'd used, but wrong. That it had been an act of appropriation masquerading as stewardship. He wrote, I have examined whether I would make that choice differently if I could, and I find that I would not, which is perhaps the most damning thing I can say about myself. He wrote about the conscience covenants with a directness that Harry hadn't expected, not minimizing them, not reframing them. He said they had been a mistake. He said he had filed them in a period of paranoia following Voldemort's return, when he had been genuinely afraid that Harry would be turned or broken or lost, and the covenants had been an attempt to bind what he could not protect by other means. He said this didn't make them acceptable. He said, fear is the oldest justification for control. I should have known better. I did know better and I did it anyway. That is not a contradiction I can resolve. He wrote about Harry's mother. About the 1981 meeting at Gringotts that Ragnarok had described. He said Lily had come to dispute a contract that James had filed before Harry's birth, not knowing at the time that Dumbledore had encouraged James to file it. He said she had sat across from the Gringotts representatives and argued with a precision and a passion that he had subsequently heard described by Ragnarok, and that he had, when he learned of it, understood that he was building his architecture over someone who had already seen it and objected to it, and who could not be consulted because she was dead, and that this knowledge had sat in him for 40 years like a stone. He wrote, your mother understood exactly what was happening before any of the instruments were in place. She saw it in the first contract and she objected. I have thought about that for 40 years, and I will think about it for whatever time remains. If there is a judgment beyond this one, I expect she will have something to say. The last paragraph was short. You asked me nothing, throughout this entire process, that was not entirely within your rights to ask. You built your case with precision and patience and complete integrity. Whatever I think of the outcome, I am proud of how you conducted yourself. I recognize that my pride is no longer something you have any reason to value. I offer it nonetheless, for whatever it is worth. A.D. Harry folded the letter. He sat at his kitchen table for a long time. Then he opened his own writing case, the one he kept for letters that needed to be handwritten, and found a clean sheet of parchment and a pen, and he wrote back. He wrote one paragraph. He wrote it carefully, not because he labored over the words but because the words mattered and he wanted them to be right. I read your letter. I understand more than I did, which is what you intended. I don't have the capacity to tell you that any of it was right, because I don't believe it was. But I believe that you believed it was, and I believe you've spent 40 years with the parts that weren't, and I think the weight of that is probably sufficient. Live your private life well. That's all I have. H.P. He sealed it, addressed it to the Geneva townhouse, and sent it by Minerva, who took the letter with her usual air of mild irritation and disappeared out the kitchen window into the October morning. He didn't know if it was forgiveness. He didn't think it needed to be. It was simply the truth of where he was, offered to someone who had asked for nothing and had gotten something anyway. 3 weeks later, the exile instrument was executed. Harry was not in Brussels when it happened. He was in Edinburgh, sitting in a small conference room above the Potions Collective's main laboratory, across the table from Draco Malfoy and 2 members of the Magical Law Reform Coalition, going over the draft language for the revised proxy authority legislation. The meeting had been Hermione's suggestion and Draco's invitation, both of which had arrived in the same week, which Harry suspected was not a coincidence. Draco had been, not warm, because Draco Malfoy was constitutionally incapable of warm in any conventional sense, but direct. He'd sat down, looked at Harry across the conference room table, and said, "I heard you told Sarah it worked." "Thank you." And then he'd opened his copy of the draft legislation and said, "The definition of minor heir in Clause 7 is too broad. It would catch cases that should legitimately use proxy authority. You need a narrower qualifier." And they'd got to work. The meeting lasted 4 hours. Draco was sharp and specific and had the kind of technical legal mind that Harry suspected had always been there and had never previously been applied to anything useful. He had opinions about clause structure and evidentiary thresholds and the oversight mechanism they were proposing, and most of his opinions were correct, which Harry noted and credited without making anything of it. At one point, near the end of the meeting, there was a pause while someone refilled the tea, and Draco looked at Harry across the table with the expression of someone who is going to say a thing and has decided to just say it. "You could have let us stay exposed," he said. The 47 contracts. After the session, once the political climate shifted, there would have been people who wanted secondary party scrutiny. "You could have let that happen." "I know," Harry said. "You didn't." "No." Draco was quiet for a moment, looking at the draft legislation. "I'm not going to make this sentimental," he said. "But I want to acknowledge it." "Acknowledged," Harry said. And then, because the moment required something more than brevity and he found he meant it, "The work you're doing here is good work. I hope it continues." Draco looked at him with an expression that was slightly startled and then wasn't, the way a face reacts when it receives something it wasn't expecting and then decides to accept it at face value rather than looking for the trap. "It will," he said. They went back to Clause 7. The legislation was introduced to the Wisengamot 6 weeks after that, co-sponsored by the Reform Coalition and formally supported by a public statement from Harry that was 3 paragraphs long, clearly argued, and contained no reference to himself except where legally necessary. It passed in the first reading. Neville attended the session and sent Harry a mirror message afterward that said, "First reading passed." Gran watched from the gallery. She looked like she'd been expecting it for 30 years. Harry sent back, "She probably had." Hermione sent the ICW liaison offer acceptance letter from Brussels on a Friday afternoon and followed it with a Patronus, the otter, bright and quick, that carried a single word, yes. Harry was in his flat when the Patronus arrived, sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of tea and a new book that had nothing to do with magical law, and the otter did its bright arc through the air of his flat and faded, and he sat in the quiet that followed and felt the shape of the days ahead, not mapped or pinned or architected by someone else's agenda. Just open. Full of things that hadn't happened yet. He thought about the archive. The copper and parchment smell of the sealed room below the earth. The ledger, dark green and heavy, with its 2,117 entries marching forward in the horrible industrious order of someone else's plan. He thought about his mother, young and precise and furious, sitting across from goblin officials who were constrained by the law and could not help her, arguing in the way that Ragnarok had described with a clarity that had come from seeing exactly what was being built and refusing to accept that it was inevitable. He thought about the key. He'd returned it to Ragnarok after the session. It had served its purpose. He opened his book. Outside the window, London went on in its enormous, ordinary way, buses and pigeons and the particular grey-gold light of a November afternoon, indifferent and generous in equal measure, entirely unbothered by the internal life of the person sitting at the kitchen table on the 4th floor. The tea was good. The book was good. The afternoon was quiet, and his own, and nobody had filed any contracts in his name today or was planning to tomorrow, and the record was complete and public and permanent, and his mother had argued clearly against the thing that had happened to him and was now formally in the record too, which meant the argument she'd made and lost had eventually won, 42 years later, by other hands, and that was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. He turned the page. The November light moved across the floor of the flat in the slow way light moves in autumn, and the hours passed, and Harry Potter sat in the uncomplicated grace of an afternoon that belonged entirely to him, and read his book, and drank his tea, and was simply, quietly, completely free.